Ваня, здравствуй.
Здравствуй.
Как живешь?
Хорошо.
Что это у тебя такое?
Это глад.
Глад? Прилетел, да?
Да.
Только первый грохот, я не знаю, с какой стороны мы услышали. Я говорю, давай бежать. Все, уже другого выхода нет.
Она бакает в этой стороне, и в этой, везде бакает. И дом бомба прямо попала. Да так бомбили, что мне уши закладывала. Всю ночь стреляли до утра.
Прям ракеты перелетали. Я теперь поняла, как сердце болит.
Я сидел рядом с окном, и раз, и у нас залетел снаряд. Мы добежали до двери, и все начало сыпаться. А там осколки попали в кишу.
Когда все развеялось, лежу тут лежит сын мой, мама. Тут лежала, тут свекровь лежала вот этих, на этих воронках. А там чуть дальше дедушка наш мертвый лежал. Я детей похватала, побежала с ними в подвал. А когда уже в подвале посветила фонариком, увидела, что у ребенка нет пальца.
Вчера, когда его выносила, он мне говорил: мама, я ведь только начал жить. За что?
Я когда увидел маму с папой, бежаешь, мне было страшно. Чисто было страшно смотреть на них.
Скажите, пожалуйста, почему вы никогда не говорите правды?
Это не ДНР нас убивает, а вот эти фашисты, которые окружили нашу Авдеевку.
Порошенко хочет войны, и он не понимает, что такое мир. Нас Порошенко предал, но я хочу, чтобы был мир. Чтобы все люди мирились, даже если чуть-чуть поссорились. И не хочу, чтобы было никаких ссор, и никогда больше не было войны. Пусть они, допустим, завтра это все закончат, и не будет войны больше никогда, 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 никогда. Мамочка, пожалуйста, мне страшно.
Не бойся, Зай.
Такое не забывается. Мама в слезах, малыш, надо бежать. Под ногами земля взрывается. Я молчу, боюсь маму напугать. А на утро возвращается долгожданная минута тишины. Почему такое получается? Неужто взрослые забыли, как были детьми?
Я собрал все свои игрушки. Я дарю их вам на много лет. Только пускай больше не стреляют пушки. Я такой же, как вы, пусть и маленький человек. Я собрал все свои игрушки. Я дарю их вам на много лет. Только пускай больше не стреляют пушки. Я хочу мира, а мира нет.
Вот кого вы калечите, кого вы убиваете. Посмотрели? Посмотрели? Жалко.
За что убили моего ребенка?
Они уничтожают наших детей.
Вы посмотрите, здесь одни игрушки, ну как же так?
Такое не забывается. Испуганный крик: мам, вставай, надо бежать. От руки холод, сердце вонзается. За что же посмели маму меня отнять?
Я собрал
обращаюсь к вам лично, Петр Порошенко, и прошу вас, будьте мужчиной, перестаньте убивать женщин и детей, не занимайтесь геноцидом. Хватит посылать к нам батальоны карателей, которые насилуют нас, убивают и издеваются над мирным населением. Мы не оккупированы никакими террористами, мы просто не хотим быть с вами. Перестаньте подавать эти чудовищные приказы по убийству мирного населения.
От того, что ты большой, ничего не меняется. Ты глупый, если желаешь войны. Почему такое получается? Наверное, взрослые забыли, как были детьми.
Давайте жить дружно.
In late 2004, protests erupted in Kiev after Viktor Yanukovych won that year's Ukrainian presidential election, with protesters claiming that the vote had been rigged. The protests forced a revote, in which Yanukovych's rival, Viktor Yushchenko, was elected president. This movement, dubbed the Orange Revolution for the orange ribbons and clothing sported by its members, was one of a series of so-called color revolutions which swept the former Soviet republics in the last decade. As The Guardian noted at the time of the protests, the campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that, in 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. The Democratic Party's National Democratic Institute, the Republican Party's International Republican Institute, the U.S. State Department, and USAID are the main agencies involved in these grassroots campaigns. So it is not without reason that seasoned political observers looked for outside connections to the recent protests in Ukraine that has, in an almost exact repeat of the 2004 protests, sought to overthrow the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych in order to install Viktor Yushchenko's political allies. These connections have not been difficult to find.
We're talking about Victoria Nuland, the top U.S. diplomat for Europe, Assistant Secretary. This is about a phone call she was having with the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeff Pyatt. And I got to say, for a diplomatic reporter like me, it was a fascinating conversation.
He's now gotten both Sari and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Sari could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
Audio of Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland apparently dictating who the US wanted in and out of the supposedly grassroots-supported interim government only came as a surprise to those who did not believe Washington or its allies in the Washington Consensus were actively involved with the ongoing protests in the country. As did the revelation of her admission last December that the US had already pumped $5 billion into the funding of the Ukrainian opposition.
Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the United States has supported Ukrainians as they build democratic skills and institutions, as they promote civic participation and good governance, all of which are preconditions for Ukraine to achieve its European aspirations. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
As did the appearance of confirmed terrorist supporter John McCain at a rally with the leader of the Ukrainian neo-Nazi Svoboda party leader. as did the appointment of a central banker as the interim prime minister and his immediate announcement that the country was in talks with the US, EU, and IMF for emergency loans.
Ukraine's acting Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk said on Friday he is determined to comply with conditions set by the International Monetary Fund in exchange for loans. An IMF mission is due in Kiev next week for talks with Ukraine's de facto leaders, who have said the heavily indebted country needs at least $35 billion to stave off bankruptcy.
As did the appearance of a slick new viral propaganda video in English promoting the supposedly grassroots uprising, which was immediately exposed as finding its inspiration in Council on Foreign Relations member Larry Diamond, who has worked closely with the same NED and USAID that were linked to the 2004 Orange Revolution.
And now I ask you to build this freedom in our country. You can help us only by telling this story to your friends, only by sharing this video. Please share it. Speak to your friends, speak to your family, speak to your government, and show that you support us.
In the latest startling revelation, Pando.com has published documents implicating the Omidyar network in the funding of the current Ukrainian protest movement. The Omidyar network is the NGO of billionaire eBay co-founder Pierre Omidyar, who recently set up First Look Media as an outlet for, among others, Glenn Greenwald, Jeremy Scahill, and Laura Poitras to selectively publish some of the Snowden document archive, 99% of which continues to be withheld from the public. As geopolitical analysts from across the board explain, the Ukrainian coup has been deliberately provoked by outside agents to promote a combination of US, EU, NATO, and IMF interests.
We have the publication on YouTube of the extraordinary open telephone discussion between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and the ambassador in Kiev, her ambassador Payet. And this was a phone call made while she was in Kiev in early February, where she literally talked person by person who the US, who Washington, who Victoria Nuland, and her faction anyway, were going to place in the government. And they said, for example, Klitschko, I want on the outside, and the Svoboda, this neo-Nazi right-wing party that got a huge amount of votes in the last election, I want them on the outside, and let's have Yulia Tymoshenko's man on the inside as prime minister, and so forth. Because he has more international credibility. And then she, in the video, this famous statement of hers with eloquent English, she said, "Fuck the EU, they want Klitschko in there," and and so forth. So it became very clear this was a direct U.S. State Department coup d'état instrumentalizing to the person who they were going to bring in to oust a democratically elected in an election which Western election monitors claimed was relatively fraud-free. So Yanukovych, because people were fed up with the previous government of Yushchenko, this was the pro-NATO government, they voted Yanukovych because they felt maybe they would get a little bit better situation under him. So this was an elected government. The U.S. comes in and says, we don't like what you do, so we're going to change you by essentially our color revolution part 2.
So that we're dealing with a situation whereby foreign countries are now, well, we know that this is regime change, we know it, but for an intergovernmental organization such as the World Bank or the IMF to take a stance on regime change is ultimately, it's another set of concepts, but it's not something which doesn't have precedent. And the IMF says, we like this particular president, we don't like that particular president. And they will also put barriers, for instance, on any type of social legislation which might emerge, such as increasing the minimum wage, such as spending more on hospitals and schools. And I mean, I've seen this in numerous countries. So that what is likely to emerge if a neo-Nazi government or neo-Nazi coalition government is formed is in fact the reinforcement, ironically, of the neoliberal shock treatment agenda for the Ukraine.
Perhaps more worrying than the interference itself are its potential implications. As Russia's every move is now being scrutinized for a possible military response to the ongoing crisis, the specter of a larger military operation now hangs over Eastern Europe. Part of the decade-long encirclement of Russia by NATO and deliberate provocations on Russia's doorstep, this process of brinksmanship now threatens to plunge the region into a war the consequences of which cannot be foreseen, let alone contained.
We are talking about, as you said, an unfolding situation, and what I'm discussing is the risk. And what we see is the carelessness and recklessness of Washington in pushing these risks. There's no reason for this. What does it matter if Ukraine is in the EU or not? I mean, how insane is it to expect to have American missile bases in Ukraine? So this, what we, regardless of the outcome, even if we get the best possible outcome, we still have the situation where Washington has created extremely reckless events that are full of risk for the entire world. The entire world. So how can you have such a dangerous, reckless, careless government running around as a superpower? I mean, the United States is a threat to life on Earth. That's what we are facing here. Now, these risks may never develop. Putin may calm them down, keep everything on a diplomatic level. That's entirely possible. He's inclined that way. He has these skills. They will resort to force only as a last resort, when they are strategically threatened. But the United States is the one who brings these extreme, reckless risks to the world. And when is the world going to recognize that and disassociate and stop enabling this extreme recklessness that emanates from Washington? It is a danger to all life on Earth, and it's enabled by the EU. NATO. What do you need NATO for? NATO was there to stop the Red Army from overrunning Europe. The Red Army disappeared 23 years ago. Well, why is NATO being expanded all over the world? They're even talking to Japan about it. So this kind of recklessness is what is the danger. It's a far greater danger than the right-wing elements in Western Ukraine. And that's what the world has got to realize and come to grips with. And the Americans themselves have got to realize that this is an act of insanity to take a direct strategic threat to a major military power. This is insane.
As supposedly progressive outlets once again scramble to throw their support behind the billionaire oligarchs and NGOs that have helped to destabilize the country, and as neocons unite with neoliberals in their agenda to carve up Ukraine for Western interests, it remains to be seen what genuine alternative outlets will stand up against this blatant interference and stand up for the principle that it is up to the Ukrainian people and no one else to decide what happens in their country.
Let's look at what's going on in the news. There is breaking news once again coming out of a Ukraine area, but we're going to tie this all together to kind of in a short broadcast here to really get you up to speed on what's going on, what's causing this, and how this is reflective of biblical prophecy. Ukraine says Russia has moved troops, missiles across the border, escalating tensions. This was reported on the Wall Street Journal on August 19th today. Ukraine officials say that Russia has slipped new air defense equipment and troops across the border into eastern part of the country as part of the effort to step up pressure on Kiev. The assessment, Ukraine's defense intelligence says that 165 Russian troops, part of an air defense battery from the 60th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, have been operating inside the separatist-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine officials believe the new troops have been operating there for at least a week. They are inside Ukraine, said Colonel Serhiy Strelchuk, the Ukrainian defense attaché in Belgium. They are there to fight against Ukraine armed forces. They have everything necessary to conduct combat operations. Now, I personally, you can't have to say this here. In light of the UN statement that was released a couple of weeks back, a few weeks ago actually, where they state the largest death toll of eastern Ukraine citizens since the start of the war. I believe that's gotten Russia's attention. Of course, we already know Brian Whitmore of the Daily Vertical really kind of flubbed that up when he made it look like it was Russia killing them all, when in fact it was actually Ukraine soldiers killing the eastern Ukraine citizens that are there in the region. Because why? Their indiscriminate bombings there that they do on a continual basis is hitting civilian targets, not even hitting the troops there that they have there fighting against them. But in recent weeks here, it has been an onslaught, steadily onslaught against the eastern people of Ukraine there, and it has not been any let up, and it has been, the death tolls have been rising rapidly. And of course, Kiev is trying to blame eastern Ukraine for this, and it's not been a provocation from them to begin with. They have only been fighting back as they have been shelled. But unfortunately, Western media is very much pro the Ukrainian government, Petro Poroshenko, that they put in there. And so you're not going to see an unbiased approach when it comes to this. So has Russia moved in? Absolutely, Russia has moved in. And now I have not been able to corroborate the information that Russia has brought in the air batteries. But, you know, if you look at it, even in the article here by the Wall Street Journal, it is air defense equipment and troops across the border into the eastern part of the country. That's a defensive measure. That's not an offensive measure. That's them there defending those people because the bombardment just does not let up. And Kiev is using some very heavy artillery on these people here. So I think Russia is finally getting enough. And yes, Putin has moved a lot more troops to the Crimean border on the north of Crimea there, in conjunction, as well as moving upwards to 95,000 troops in a permanent base that they have built along the Ukraine eastern side there, with the possibility of needing to protect these people. Putin has had, I believe, enough, and the provocations from Kiev government has been ongoing. It's been a non-stop, no let-up at all. The United States military and Canadian militaries are both there inside Ukraine. They've been training, helping, supporting the Kiev forces there. They installed the government, so what do you expect? Let's continue on, guys, though. Also, the Wall Street Journal reported Russia builds up the army near Ukraine border. Russia is bolstering its military presence on the western border, sending tens of thousands of soldiers to a newly built installation within easy striking distance of Ukraine. The moves, which come as Moscow ratchets up confrontation of the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea, are a centerpiece of a new military strategy the Kremlin says is meant to counter perceived threats from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO in other words, because why? NATO is also, before Russia ever did it, again, I have to stress this, NATO has shown aggressiveness by sending their own forces there to the border with Russia, even as we have reported here on Israeli News Live, upwards to nearly 100 tanks on the Narva River. Do you not think that's not a provocation to Russia? And they call it just, well, military exercises, and that there's no threat that Russia has to worry about. Guys, the West has broken every treaty agreement that has been done with Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And they continually reverse this around. It was not Russia that toppled the government to begin with. That's kind of an absurdity when Russia had to rescue Ukraine's former prime minister there. He had to be rescued by Russia because of the coup that's going on, and the coup was not a Russian coup. That was a coup backed by the Western powers there. So a lot of false information coming out that we're getting on our end in America because no one's telling the truth about it. Anyway, DPR prepares for full-scale war with pro-Kiev forces. This is from the southfront.org. These are the separatists in eastern Ukraine there. They're saying here, artillery attacks have dramatically increased around the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic. And Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko said that he does not exclude a full-scale Russian invasion in all directions. The smell of war again appeared in the eastern Ukraine. An essence of the matter lies in details. Strengthening of attacks may be different, larger artillery calibers, more shots, and more victims at this time. We can say that the war in Donbass loses its borders. Attacks are becoming more frequent and more long range. The artillery has covered Ukraine villages in the direction of Mariupol, where shells did not fly more than the year and a half. Borders of the war in Donbass are very conditional, but most often maintained. In other words, let me break it down because I can see it's Russian writing trying to do this in English. What they're trying to tell you is that they're being heavily attacked more and more, and the borders are constantly changing because where the Minsk agreement had given a buffer zone there, the pro-Kiev forces of Ukraine are constantly going across that, and they're using larger and larger military equipment there, attacking the people in eastern Ukraine. As we stated in one of our news broadcasts, the next war on East Ukraine would be a war, if Kiev launches a war, it'll be a war on civilians. But that may change. We made that statement, but if Russia steps in to back them up to keep them from being annihilated, that could change altogether. I wanted to share with you this video footage here. This was captured earlier today. And we'll kill the volume on that. Don't really need the volume in here because they're just playing music in their car. That is Russian troops, guys. You are seeing this. This appeared on Ukrainian website there, showing the Russian military in Crimea. This is the north part of Crimea. Yes, so Russia is. We already know this. It's been in the news quite a bit. They're building up their forces and they're getting ready for, what they may have to deal with. Again, I do believe that with Russia, I don't think Russia is here to provoke something. Russia has been digging in for a defensive posture, not an offensive posture. This here, of course, this is a little bit old. That is more than double from what we're seeing now. 40,000 Russian troops are preparing for war in Crimea, and the U.S. is extremely concerned. Business Insider, August 17th, reported this. The Pentagon has identified 8 staging areas in Russia where large numbers of military forces appear to be preparing for incursions into Ukraine, according to U.S. defense officials. As many as 40,000 Russian troops, including tanks, armored vehicles, Air Force units, are now arrayed along eastern borders with Russia. Again, what do you expect Russia to do? Is America just allowed to go in? Now, when I say America, let me stress that the Obama administration and all his little cronies that he has that are backing him in different parts of the world. But are they allowed to just go in there and mount all this massive military exercises, as they call it, and not just exercises, but put a full-scale military presence in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, all these places that are on Russia's doorstep, and then expect Russia not to counter this measure, especially in light, because this is what you're not being told. If you want to go online, if you want to go on Twitter, whatever the case may be, Google, Facebook, anywhere you want to see, you're going to see where Poroshenko's government is talking about they're being shelled and the number of times of violation. But, it's the other side has their side too. And that can easily be seen by Frontline, or they actually call it the Line Front. That's the pro-separatist group there, where they're reporting all the times of the, the violation of the ceasefire agreements that are there. Especially in Twitter, if you just put in Donetsk, hashtag Donetsk, you will see unbelievable amount of people letting you know what is happening at the moment. They're giving testimony, incoming. It is a huge number of attacks that are happening on these people in eastern Ukraine. And most of them, it is civilians that are being killed. That's the bad part of the war. It's too many civilians are losing their lives over this. But it's constantly made to look like Russia is the provocator here. Provocateur, I should say, but it's not. Now, here's where we come into the biblical side of this, of Daniel 11's prophecy. Now, this is an old article here, but as the guy that rewrote this on March 4th, it actually came out, I believe, in February of this year, he said it's a much ignored huge news report from Reuters on Friday, February 27th, was headlined, Chinese diplomat tells West to consider Russia's security concerns over Ukraine. Now, he entitles this, China has just warned America to leave Russia alone or else. Although his title is not what really the Chinese ambassador has to say there to Belgium, it's still very much reminiscent of what the Chinese government's sentiments are when it comes to their relationships with Russia and that of the West pushing against them. And by the way, China's doing a huge sell-off of all of its American asset dollars and using it to buy gold. That's only going to make the economy for the U.S. in a very unstable position. But like Russia, they are also becoming a huge gold buyer. I suppose they're getting ready for something pretty big, if you ask me. Anyway, China's ambassador to Belgium, which is not the capital of the EU, said that the nature and root cause of the Ukraine conflict is the West. And that the West should abandon the zero-sum mentality and take the real security concerns of Russia into consideration. Now, he's talking about that they're provoking Russia with all these NATO movements towards Russia's borders. By real security concerns, he says, he is clearly referring to the NATO expansion right at the Russian border, the writer says here, and America surrounding Russia with U.S. military bases, now increasingly including the most strategic of Russia's bordering countries, Ukraine. So it is happening, guys. And we're seeing this. Now watch this. It gets more interesting. Now, Syria, this just was out yesterday on the journal neo.org. Syria, China, and Iran join Russia in larger role. This is breaking news today, we find out as well. China has sent in military troops to help Syria. Watch the article, several developments this week mark an increase in activity from Syria's allies, Russia, Iran, and now China. These include Russian-Iranian agreement to use Iranian territory to position Russian Tupolev Tu-22M strategic bombers, as well as Iranian and Iraqi airspace for both the bombers and Russian cruise missiles to pass through on their way to militant targets in Syria. Do you know why Iran is willing to get involved in this? Because those militant groups are Western-backed. They're backed by the Obama administration. And Iran doesn't like the Obama administration anyway. It also includes China's recent pledge to provide humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people, as well as what? Military support for the Syrian government troops in their fight to restore order nationwide.
Because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we got a good military and we can take down governments. And he said, I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And then Syria.
We had a chance to talk about a wide range of international issues, including the situation in Syria. And I have to say that all of us who've been seeing the terrible pictures coming out of Syria and Homs recently recognize it is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition, it is time for that regime to move on, and it is time to stop the killing of Syrian citizens by their own government.
Lebanon.
They both had different reasons, the State Department and the White House, for wanting Israel to do it, encouraging them to do it, and supporting them. Our Air Force worked very closely with the Israeli Air Force for months before this, not necessarily with a deadline, knowing when it would happen. It was always going to be whenever there was an incident, they would take advantage of an incident. The word I used was fortunate timing. When Hezbollah grabbed some of the Israeli soldiers in early July, that was then a pretext, I think that's the only word, for a major offensive that had been in the works a long time.
Libya.
Today we can definitively say that the Gaddafi regime has come to an end. The last major regime strongholds have fallen. The new government is consolidating the control over the country, and one of the world's longest-serving dictators is no more.
Somalia.
Well, violence isn't only on the rise in Afghanistan. In fact, it looks like America's shadow wars have now increased by 1. Drone strikes have long been reported in Pakistan and Yemen, but now there's news that a week ago, a U.S. drone aircraft fired on 2 leaders of the Somalian organization Al-Shabaab.
Sudan.
President Obama is sending 100 combat-equipped troops to Central Africa to advise local forces on getting rid of one of the continent's most vicious operatives, Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, a group responsible for atrocities across the region. It's the first open deployment of U.S. ground combat power to Africa since the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia in the 1990s that killed 18 troops. U.S. troops may wind up now in Uganda, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's part of a growing military effort to engage in Africa.
Finishing off Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, you remember that? He said, sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you.
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So go through the countries again?
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran.
Israeli News Live, guys, we have breaking news. RT is reporting that the U.S.-led coalition has struck Syrian army positions. This has only happened just a few hours ago. It's according to the Syrian General Command. It says the U.S.-led coalition airstrikes Syrian army positions. You've heard that exactly right. The coalition jets have bombed Syrian government forces positions near the eastern city of Deir ez-Zor, paving the way for the Islamic State militants. The Syrian army general command told the state television. According to the Syrian officials, Sana news agency, the bombing took place on Al-Tadar mountain in the region of Deir ez-Zor. All right, now I'm going to, real quick, guys, I'm going to jump over here. We're going to try to get you... coming from Fars news agency, along with other news agency. The Sputnik News is reporting that some 30 Israeli foreign intelligence officers killed in a Russian caliber missile attack in Aleppo. And according to this here, it says several U.S., Turkish, Saudi, Qatari, and British officers were also killed, along with Israeli officers. The foreign officers who were killed in Aleppo operations room were directing the terrorist attacks in Aleppo.
It was our consideration that we had to reach out to the U.S. peace movement and ask that they participate in a delegation to Syria to see for themselves what existed, to speak to both officials and non-officials, civil society, to try to determine for themselves, independently, the situation in Syria and the road to peace. That is our responsibility. Our responsibility is to reach out first to the U.S. peace movement and then to the American people. The campaign to confuse the American people has been intense. And it is our purpose to try to bring some light, some understanding, which can perhaps lead to the American people demanding an end to the intervention and peace in Syria.
What Alfred said is so true. We are fighting a mass of propaganda that has demonized the Syrian government, demonized its leaders, an effort that precedes every other intervention that the United States has made over the course of many, many decades in order to convince people that it's okay for quote-unquote humanitarian reasons to overthrow a government and to replace it with whatever. The United States prefers a government that is not independent, that is a willing participant in what the whatever U.S. policy is. So what we saw in Damascus and what we saw in the two villages we visited outside Damascus belies the propaganda that has overwhelmed us. It's hard. It's hard for even those of us who have been in the peace movement for a long time. It's hard for us to ignore this propaganda. It is so well orchestrated.
Work together, coming back in cooperation to try to bring the message and the truth back to the United States. As an American citizen, it is shameful for me to admit what my government is doing in the sovereign country of Syria. We have no right to impose these illegal sanctions. In fact, these sanctions, allegedly, the government says are against the government of Syria, but in fact it's against the people, civil society, people who are attempting to maintain the infrastructure, the health care, the safety of all Syrian people. One of the things that stood out to me is not only the lack of medication and the fact that Syrian children are dying because they can't get chemotherapy meds into the country because of the illegal sanctions that the U.S. and the West has imposed. Also, they're not allowing parts and material to get to businesses who are trying to maintain. And they're trying to maintain for more than one reason, and not just to keep continue to make money, but to employ people. Because when people have no way to earn a living, they become desperate. And we know that some of the Syrian people who may have chosen to join the terrorists, mostly for economic reasons, because they couldn't earn a living. And their benefactors, the U.S. and all the others who are collaborating together to fund this terrorism, are paying people very well to participate in this illegal activity against the Syrian people.
Without the support of these three countries, without the arms that have been given to ISIS, either they've been given directly to Jabhat al-Nusra and have gone to ISIS, or they've gone the other way, or they've gone to the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar, but the French, the British, the Americans, and the Turks have all supplied those who have kept ISIS going. You know, if David Cameron had won his Commons vote a couple of years ago, ISIS would now be in charge in Syria. In other words, the Middle East's most multi-ethnic, multicultural state would be finished, and these fanatics would be in charge, and that will be thanks entirely to Western actions. Western actions that are reinforced by our propaganda. Yeah, well, that was 2013. Dumas, in an interview on French television, said that he was happened to be in England, and he was invited in to see people in the government and asked if he would like to take part in a project they had, and that project was an attack on Syria. But, you know, that's 2013. We can go back to the 1950s when the British intelligence was plotting the end of the regime in Syria. Syria's crime, Syria's main crime, is that it is independent, and it stands against Israel dominating that part of the world. It stands these days with Iran, it stands with the other opponents, Hezbollah, now with Russia. There is no question that if there was an election tomorrow, all those minorities that look to this government in Damascus for all its violations of human rights, and no one doubts those, look to it as its protector. because the alternative is ISIS. And everything the West has done has been to create first the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, then with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, then in 2011, the invasion and destruction of Libya. The Russians, Putin, it seems to be one of the most serious people involved in the Middle East. He pointed out that the long lines of trucks, ISIS trucks that are stealing Syria's oil, haven't been bombed haven't been interdicted during the so-called Western war against ISIS. The Western war against ISIS has been a farce. While feeding the monster of the fanaticism through Jabhat al-Nusra, through ISIS, apparently through something called the Free Syrian Army, which, as we now know, doesn't exist, in effect, doesn't exist. But now we have right across the board, and that includes serious papers who claim to their readers that they have some gravity, some conscience, like The Guardian, being part of this orchestration, for the escalation of war in that part of the world. When The Guardian suppresses comment that it should be patently obvious to anybody that it is the West that has created this monster of killing and suffering and of dispossession in the Middle East. But the propaganda is even more lethal because it comes from sources of news that have credibility. Advisor who set it up. And we've seen this support for fanaticism, Islamic fanaticism, by Western governments, right, you can go further back. Go back to the time when the Muslim Brotherhood, at its most fanatical, was given a place to organize in the offices of the Suez Canal Company, then controlled by Britain. Read Mark Curtis's extraordinary book about this alliance between imperial Western governments and Muslim, and the creation of Muslim fanaticism. While doing that, demanding that the one government that could stand up to them, that's in Damascus, be overthrown. You know, the wish list is, at the top of the wish list is there has to be a concerted effort, clearly, to stop the destruction of Syria, the final destruction. The second priority should be all the parties negotiating a way to deal with ISIS. I can't imagine that happening.
Western state terrorism is the main source of terrorism in the world. The victims of terrorism, the greatest number of victims of terrorism are Muslim people. Those two facts need to be almost scratched on the bathroom mirrors of anybody with a public voice, because they're truths. The other point I wish to make is that, unfortunately, because there is really no free information available in the mainstream in Australia, you haven't heard that ISIS is on the verge of defeat. The corridor to Turkey has been closed. The Syrian army has effectively defeated ISIS, backed by the Russians, backed by Hezbollah, backed by Iran. Whatever Australia does there is beside the point. So I would think, as far as Syria is concerned, and this is not as far as Iraq is concerned, but as far as Syria is concerned, I think ISIS, I dare to make a prediction, I think ISIS will be defeated, and that defeat is happening now.
It seems as though it keeps appearing a power vacuum that just, you know, ISIS are filling that, but it was created after a previous withdrawal. I mean, I think there's a lot more to the story than just defeating terrorism.
ISIS was created. ISIS is not much different from the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Al Qaeda in Iraq, the various tribal groups who had affiliations to Al Qaeda and others in Libya and in Syria. All these places are places where we, quote unquote, have destroyed societies. There was no jihadism in Iraq when I drove the length of Iraq shortly before the invasion. None. And I felt perfectly safe. There was no jihadism in Libya when it was controlled and run quite successfully by the dictator Gaddafi. There was no jihadism in Syria before it was imported in the guise of a rebellion in Syria. So I think the most important thing is we do have to look in that bathroom mirror, in that mirror. We talk about them constantly. We have to talk about us.
Okay.
On Wednesday morning, the Federation Council Upper House of Parliament granted permission to the Russian president to use the country's troops in Syria. Kremlin Chief of Staff Sergei Ivanov said that Russia will only use its air force in Syria, and it does this on Syrian President Assad's request. On Wednesday afternoon, the Russian Air Force began to conduct air raids against the Islamic rebels of Jabhat al-Nusra inside the Latakia and Hama governorates in the western part of Syria. These provinces would reportedly be the primary target for the Russian Air Force and the Syrian Arab Army. According to scrappy reports, the Russian Air Force targeted the areas of Al-Latamina, Kafzita, the Jabal Azawid, Kasab, and Diahana. At the moment, airstrikes are aimed on the Syrian branch of Al Qaeda. However, it's clear that the ISIS positions inside eastern Syria will be targeted in the nearest future. Meanwhile, the Syrian Arab Army's Special Forces Division, known as the Tiger Forces, have deployed their units to the East Aleppo front to help lift the ISIS's siege of the Huweiris military airport. Lifting the siege from the airport will open additional opportunities of the Syrian Air Force's usage in the conflict and free forces and facilities which could be used to relieve the situation in the sector. It is very possible that Russia will use Iraq's vast airspace in the nearest future. Iraq is imperative to Russia's fight against ISIS due to its geographical location. In other cases, Russia's airstrikes in eastern Syria would be limited because of the terrorists' ability to use Iraq's wide-open highways. Earlier, South Front Analysis and Intelligence reported that Russia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria have made an agreement to set in Baghdad a joint information center to coordinate their operations against ISIS. The positioning of Russian aircraft in Syria gives the Kremlin an ability to shape and control the battle space in both Syria and Iraq out of all proportion to the size of the Russian force. It could impact the US to accept a combined coalition with Russia, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Lebanese Hezbollah in support of operations against ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. Separately, the contemporary situation can probably lead to the establishment of a permanent Russian air and naval base in the eastern Mediterranean.
On September 30th, 2015, Russia began airstrikes against ISIS and its affiliates in Syria. These strikes were conducted at the request of the Syrian government. Iran followed, announcing that they were preparing to send in ground troops. These developments completely changed the geopolitical equation, not just in Syria. Western politicians and their corporate media lapdogs are obviously not happy about where this is headed, and they've taken to the airwaves in force to voice their condemnation. First, they claimed that Russia was hitting moderate US-backed rebels rather than exclusively focusing on ISIS.
Of course, he moved all the capabilities in, he built the runways, he built the establishment, and then was ready to strike. And instead of revealing anything to carry from Lavrov or from him to Obama, he has a Russian general show up at our embassy in Baghdad an hour before it starts. And what's the first target? The people we are supporting in arming and training and equipment. What better way to stick their thumb in our eye?
Hey, wait a second. On September 16th, General Lloyd Austin of the U.S. Central Command testified that there were only 4 or 5 U.S. trained fighters in all of Syria. and now these fighters are supposedly in control of an entire region? This assertion would be absurd enough on its own, but the reality of the matter is that the area in question has been controlled by al-Nusra for at least 2 years. And just so we're clear here, al-Nusra is al-Qaeda's Syrian branch, and they have direct alliances with ISIS. Not that the distinction between al-Nusra and the FSA would really change the equation. The FSA has publicly acknowledged on several occasions that they are cooperating with al-Nusra, and the FSA command itself has been dominated by Islamic extremists since at least 2012.
أما فيما يخص بعض الفصائل التي مثلا يطالب الغرب بتصنيفها كمنظمات إرهابية، جبهة النصرة. نعم، نحن نشعر أن هذه الجبهة بمكان ما هي يمكن الحوار معها. حول نعم، حول طبيعة الدولة القادمة، حول شكل الدولة القادمة، حول إمكانية هذه البلد على إقامة دولة التي تناسب الجميع. نحن في مكان ما يجب أن نتعاون ويجب أن نتحاور، وأنا على صلة بالجميع. أنا على صلة بالجميع ولا أخفي سرا بذلك، حتى فيما يخص الأخوة في جبهة النصرة، ونتعاون في أمكنة كثيرة.
So, if the FSA and al-Nusra work together, and al-Nusra is working with ISIS, why haven't those funding and arming the FSA been charged with providing material support to terrorists? But Russia's airstrikes are killing civilians! Look, we have proof from the White Helmets, an NGO funded by the UK government. That's funny. This image looks an awful lot like this one, which was posted on September 25th, 5 days before the airstrikes even began. That was a bit problematic, so they deleted the tweet, but not before the US and its allies would use the occasion to take their hypocrisy to a new level. On October 2nd, the US issued a joint statement with France, Germany, the UK, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, calling for Russia to, quote, immediately cease its attacks on the Syrian opposition and civilians. Just to put this into perspective, the Saudis have been bombing Yemen, with US support, since March of 2015, killing thousands of civilians and creating a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. The irony also seemed to be lost on Washington, who after decades of military occupations and drone campaigns, which have killed millions of civilians, topped it off by repeatedly bombing a Doctors Without Borders hospital in Afghanistan just 1 day later. Oh, this is awkward. What can we do to save face? Hey, our friend John McCain has an idea. We should just send our moderate jihadists some more weapons.
They're attacking the very guys who we want to see topple Assad. You would let American planes just continue to pass them and let them do that?
No, but I might do what we did in Afghanistan many years ago to give those guys the ability to shoot down those planes. That equipment is available.
Who would be shooting them down?
The Free Syrian Army, just like the Afghans shot down the Russian. No, just like the Afghans shot down Russian planes after Russia invaded Afghanistan.
So we armed extremists in Afghanistan, which became the Taliban, which we're still bombing, often inaccurately, to this day. And you want to do it again? This isn't a plan. This is desperation. Washington has been outmaneuvered. This turn of events is on par with the 2013 episode where the US-backed rebels got caught using sarin gas against civilians. Only now, there aren't nearly as many options left. With Russia providing air support and Iran assisting in the ground campaign, the US no longer has any leverage in Syria. And if Putin is able to maintain momentum, this could very well be a turning point regionally as well. That doesn't mean the game is over though. The US and its allies aren't going to just walk away from this. You can rest assured that Washington is scrambling to cook something up right now. And if the last few years are any indicator, this could get very interesting. This video is Creative Commons. You have permission to download and distribute any and all of our content through any venue, commercial or non-commercial. If you want more people to see this information, please remember to like, share, and comment. If you want to see how far the rabbit hole really goes, keep in touch. Subscribe.
And I was simply saying, in effect, to the American people through this mock letter, be very careful about this administration creating a USS Maine incident or a Gulf of Tonkin incident that would justify bombing Iran. That's all.
A plausible scenario for a military collision with Iran involves a terrorist act in the United States, blamed on Iran, culminating in a quote-unquote defensive U.S. military action against Iran that plunges a lonely America into a spreading and deepening quagmire, eventually ranging across Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
And by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
The former official said that a few weeks later a meeting took place in the Vice President's office. Quote, "The subject was how to create a casus belli between Tehran and Washington," he said.
There was a dozen ideas proffered, how to trigger a war. The one that interested me the most was, why don't we in our shipyard build 4 or 5 Iranian boats that look like Iranian PT boats, put Navy SEALs on them with a lot of arms, and the next time one of our boats goes through the Straits of Hormuz, start a shoot-up. Might cost some lives. And it was rejected because you can't have Americans killing Americans. But that's the level of stuff we were talking about, provocation.
Now, I'm the third person, I think, to remind you of what Brzezinski warned Congress about last February, that an attack on Iran would lead to a spreading and deepening quagmire, and that it would very probably be preceded by, and these are his words, a terrorist act in the United States blamed on Iran. It almost sounds as if we should invite him to our conference. He doesn't say an incident by Iran. He said an incident blamed on Iran. On Saturday, June the 16th, there was a newspaper story in the New York Times which revealed that the New York Times is worried about this. And one of the things that is being leaked is that these attacks, if they occur, will be massive. That there are more than 450 targets, many of them underground. And the second thing that is being leaked by many people is because they are underground, that there's a serious risk that the attacks will be nuclear. This is CNN. Among the options U.S. military officials have been asked to examine is the use of nuclear weapons against underground facilities for Iran's controversial nuclear program. And here I'm going to quote from an article from a former CIA officer. It came out in 2005. He has noted that the plans to attack Iran were drawn up, quote, to be employed in response to another 9/11 type terrorist attack on the United States. And he went on and he said, just like Hirsch, that the plan includes a large-scale air assault on Iran employing both conventional and tactical nuclear weapons. As in the case of Iraq, the response is not conditional on Iran actually being involved in the act of terrorism directed against the United States. This is what Brzezinski was saying when he said that it could be preceded by a terrorist act in the United States blamed on Iran.
We have experienced the horror of September the 11th. We have seen that those who hate America are willing to crash airplanes into buildings full of innocent people. Our enemies would be no less willing. In fact, they would be eager to use biological or chemical or a nuclear weapon. Knowing these realities, America must not ignore the threat
gathering against us. Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Let me make this clear. There are terrorists holed up in those mountains who murdered 3,000 Americans. They are plotting to strike again.
This week, we even heard that intelligence officials worried there could be an attack on the United States.
And that is what is really worrying the Americans. An attack on the homeland. I have never heard the intelligence chief say anything like that, that Iran could actually move into America, that there might be sleepers here willing to attack if Israel attacks Iran. That's why there is so much concern.
Meantime, the U.S. officials think that the sanctions against Iran could work, but in the end, they know they really can't stop Israel if Israel wants to attack.
They keep trying to stop Israel, but Israel says if we want to attack, we will.
Iran's responded to the sanctions with threats to block oil trade through the crucial Strait of Hormuz, leading to a continued deadlock in the Persian Gulf. American warships are also present in the region with a mission to prevent any hindrances of passage. Let's talk to John Rees, a political activist and national officer at the Stop the War Coalition, who's in London, to get his thoughts about what we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes here. Hi there. Sanctions are often used by the West, but how effective are they really? They're often criticised, I know. Well, what do you think the US and the EU is really trying to achieve here?
Well, I think we have to understand this as a strategic foreign policy problem that the United States has had since the failure of the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq was meant to give them a stable, pro-Western, pro-business base for operations in the Middle East. What it ended up doing is making Iran a greater regional power than it was before. And so they've got to deal with this problem, and this is what the sanctions are about. But the sanctions, as we know in the past, as we know over the case of Iraq indeed, were the precursor to war. They were a way of preparing public opinion for military conflict. And therefore they are doubly dangerous in this case. They're economically dangerous in the short term, but as your news report has pointed out, we're looking at now a conflict in the Gulf of Hormuz, which is one of the main arteries of the world economy. It really couldn't get more serious than this.
And of course, the other big outcome of this that's not been missed either, we've heard from experts saying that China would be very glad to buy Iran's oil shipments if the EU refuses to. So I guess by pushing for sanctions like this, isn't the US providing an extra energy source for the very global power that's seen as Washington's economic nemesis?
Well, this is going to be the difficulty with any military conflicts in this region in years to come. You see, you can look on the Iraq war, you can look on the Afghanistan war as wars conducted by a superpower against very small countries. But the growing differentiation in the world economy, the growing military might of China, the recovery of Russia itself, is going to lead to a situation where this is not simply a conflict involving smaller powers in which the big powers want to get their way, but is going to break up any kind of international community, as it's sometimes called, and in which the major powers will be dragged into the conflicts as well. And that's a qualitatively more serious situation than the ones that we've had even in the past 10 years, and those were serious enough.
And of course, the possible economic implications as well. Is it wise, I wonder, to attempt to isolate such a major oil producer during these turbulent economic times that the world's seeing right now?
Well, you would think that some element of caution might kick in here, that just as we're on the brink of discovering that we haven't reached the pit of this recession, that there's liable to be, as I think nearly every economic commentator says at the beginning of the year, a very profoundly difficult year for the Eurozone, in which we may see the breakup of the euro, in which we're certainly going to see further austerity measures pushed through by the governments in Europe and in other places. You would think that this wasn't exactly the moment to risk further instability in the world economy.
So why no progress on restarting talks about Iran's nuclear program? And this despite the fact that Tehran has made unprecedented concessions. Russia's been suggesting this comprehensive step-by-step resolution. What is the stumbling block still at the heart of this stalemate, then, do you think?
Well, I think the stumbling block is the point I made at the beginning of this interview. You see, this isn't just about nuclear weapons. If it were about nuclear weapons in the Middle East, then the United States would have a bone to pick with Israel, which is the only power in the Middle East which actually possesses nuclear weapons. It's not about that. That's the casus belli. But the reason for this continued conflict is because the American administration simply can't live with an Iran which has as much regional power as it has at the moment. You see, the Americans, when they look at the Iranian regime, they see its links with Syria, they see its links with Hamas, they see its links with Hezbollah, and this is a challenge to American power in an absolutely critical, economically critical, geopolitically critical area of the globe, and it's that which is the sticking point for the American administration, in my view.
Just briefly, how bad could this get? We're hearing now the UK supported Washington's rhetoric, saying its warships are at the ready to prevent any attempt by Iran to hinder trade through that crucial Strait of Hormuz. Could this go further, do you think, develop into actual warfare?
Well, I think this is certainly in the minds of some of the players in the international community. We know that Israel, for instance, has had test flights out into the Mediterranean for exactly the same distance as there is between Tel Aviv and Tehran, with a view to having a strike on the nuclear facilities. And we know that even the Bush administration in its last months had to restrain the state of Israel from doing this. So we know that there are some people, hawks in Israel, hawks in the United States, who want to settle this militarily. And it does seem to me that once we begin on the process of implementing sanctions, of Iran responding to the sanctions, that there will be calls further down the road for a direct military conflict. And that, in this case, is even more dangerous than it was in the case of Iraq.
John Rees, political activist, national officer at the Stop the War Coalition, thanks for being on the line from London for us.
The Iranian armed forces continue their massive military drills in southern Iran. On Sunday, an Iranian naval patrol aircraft warned extra-regional warships during the maneuvers to leave the area. The commander of Iran's Navy, Rear Admiral Habibullah Sayyari, says the drills demonstrate Iran's defense capabilities, thanks to its advanced military technology and sophisticated domestic weaponry. He underscored that the maneuver does not mean that Iran is feeling a threat from the outside. Here now is a report.
It is the largest air, ground and sea military drill ever conducted by the Army of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The war games dubbed Mohammad Rasulullah, held in 2.2 million square kilometers of Iran's southeast at the coast of the Sea of Oman, continued for the fourth day. The military exercise was followed by a number of new experiences for the Iranian army. For the first time, Iran's Taret heavy submarines engaged in mine-laying operations aimed at securing Iran's coastal line against the penetration of hypothetical enemy. Mine-sweeping operations formerly conducted by Navy vessels were carried out by the Navy's RH helicopters for the first time.
Iran's first goal in conducting this drill is to boost the military capability of its naval forces, ground forces, air forces and air defense forces, as well as enhancing coordination among different branches of the military in order to face any possible threat.
The drill also dealt with the intrusion of 2 foreign Navy vessels to the maneuver area near the Strait of Hormuz. Navy aircraft issued warning signals leading the warships, one of them American, out of the range of Iranian missiles.
Collection warship. This is Iranian naval aircraft in normal patrol mission. You are entering Mohammad Rasulullah naval exercise zone. Please leave this training area. Over.
Accurate targeting of floating objects by Maverick rockets on F-4 fighters, as well as the successful launch of modified Sukhoi 24 rockets towards targets at sea, were among the operations that were successfully wrapped up by Iran's army. Commander of the Iranian Navy told Press TV that by holding the drill, Iran does not see any potential threat.
The final goal is to warn extra-regional countries that with the Iranian Navy present, there is no need for foreign intervention to maintain peace and security in this region.
The Iranian army, which already carries out the experience of an 8-year war with Iraq from 1980 to 1988, holds annual military exercises with the aim of upgrading its defense potentials. This is the first time that the Iranian army is holding such a wide-scale military drill. It is an exclusive opportunity for the army's air, ground, and naval forces to practice the application of homemade weapons, in addition to weapons that have been modified by Iranian experts in a completely simulated war. Amir Mehdi Kazemi, Press TV, the port city of Josk at the coast of the Oman Sea.
Well, I believe we're now going to join Amir Mehdi Kazemi himself, who is joining us live now from Josk for the latest on today's drills. Amir, what has been happening today?
Well, Wagar, today we are witnessing the fifth day of the Mohammad Rasulullah War Games, which is considered as the largest ever military drill conducted by the Iranian ground, sea, and Air Force of the Iranian Army. Of course, we have already been updated by three major developments in today's drill that include the successful launch of the Noor and Nasr cruise missiles, which have been, according to the Iranian Army, completely built and designed by Iranian engineers, successfully hitting their targets from land to sea. And the other development includes the inauguration of SH-3D torpedo-laying helicopters that intercepted hypothetical enemies, and at the same time submarines rather at sea. They launched torpedoes and successfully managed to hit the hypothetical submarines of enemies at sea. Of course, it is worth mentioning that this has taken place for the very first time, and officially the torpedo-laying helicopters of Iran have now come into operation, have become operational and ready to protect the coastal line of the Islamic Republic. The third development also includes the operation of an integral aeronautical anti-aircraft radar system, which actually sends signals to the Iranian Air Force. In this case, Iranian jet fighters managed to successfully intercept hypothetical enemy targets using this integral and aeronautical radar detecting system, and have managed to successfully target different targets at sea and on land and in the air. Back to you, Wagar.
Okay, Amir, thanks very much for that detailed update. That was Amir Mehdi Kazemi, Press TV's correspondent, who was giving us the update on the continuing military drills by the Islamic Republic.
Iranian armed forces have started the fourth phase of a massive military drill in the country's south. In the latest stage of the maneuvers, naval forces will plant mines to deter mock enemy vessels and submarines from entering coastal waters. They will also conduct naval demining exercises. The Army's F-4 fighter jets will join to provide air support to the naval fleet. According to Army officials, Sunday's maneuver is the largest missile drill in the history of Iran's military exercises. The massive military maneuvers cover an area from the east of the Strait of Hormuz to the southern parts of the Gulf of Aden. It involves the deployment of different types of military hardware and weapons, both in water and on land. Earlier, we joined by Press TV correspondent Amir Mehdi Kazemi. Here's what he told us about the fourth day of Iran's military maneuvers.
And on the fourth day of this drill, dubbed Mohammad Rasulullah, or Muhammad the Prophet of God, 5 major operations are taking place, which include, of course, mine-laying operations using Iranian heavy Tariq submarines. The mines are laid for the artificial or hypothetical enemies aimed at protecting the Iranian shores and preventing the hypothetical enemy from entering the Iranian shores, and of course mine sweeping operations, in addition to mine laying operations, which are conducted by RH helicopters for the first time. The third major development is, of course, an Iranian fighter, as far as we know, has at least issued warning signals to at least 2 foreign Navy vessels in the premises of the Oman Sea near the eastern side of the Strait of Hormuz. And as far as we know, at least one of those 2 Navy foreign vessels have been American. The reason for issuing such a warning signal by the Iranian fighter to the Navy vessels have been to take them out of the premises and take them out and lead them out of the range of Iran's surface-to-sea and sea-to-sea missiles.
The Iranian armed forces continue their massive military drills in southern Iran. On Sunday, an Iranian naval patrol aircraft warned extra-regional warships during the maneuvers to leave the area. The commander of Iran's Navy, Rear Admiral Habibullah Sayyadi, says the drills demonstrate Iran's defense capabilities, thanks to its advanced military technology and sophisticated domestic weaponry. He underscored that the maneuver does not mean that Iran is feeling a threat from the outside. Here now is a report.
It is the largest air, ground, and sea military drill ever conducted by the Army of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The war games, dubbed Mohammad Rasulullah, held in 2.2 million square kilometers of Iran's southeast at the coast of the Sea of Oman, continued for the fourth day. The military exercise was followed by a number of new experiences for the Iranian army. For the first time, Iran's Tarek heavy submarines engaged in mine-laying operations aimed at securing Iran's coastal line against the penetration of hypothetical enemy. Mine-sweeping operations formerly conducted by Navy vessels were carried out by the Navy's RH helicopters for the first time.
Iran's first goal in conducting this drill is to boost the military capability of its naval forces, ground forces, air forces, and air defense forces, as well as enhancing coordination among different branches of the military in order to face any possible threat.
The drill also dealt with the intrusion of two foreign Navy vessels to the maneuver area near the Strait of Hormuz. Navy aircraft issued warning signals leading the warships, one of them American, out of the range of Iranian missiles.
Collection warship. This is Iranian naval aircraft in normal control mission. You are entering Mohammad Rasulullah naval exercise zone. Please leave this training area. Over.
Accurate targeting of floating objects by Maverick rockets on F-4 fighters, as well as the successful launch of modified Sukhoi 24 rockets towards targets at sea, were among the operations that were successfully wrapped up by Iran's army. Commander of the Iranian Navy told Press TV that by holding the drill, Iran does not see any potential threat.
The final goal is to warn extra-regional countries that with the Iranian Navy present, there is no need for foreign intervention to maintain peace and security in this region.
The Iranian army, which already carries out the experience of an 8-year war with Iraq from 1980 to 1988, holds annual military exercises with the aim of upgrading its defense potentials. This is the first time that the Iranian army is holding such a wide-scale military drill. It is an exclusive opportunity for the army's air, ground, and naval forces to practice the application of homemade weapons, in addition to weapons that have been modified by Iranian experts in a completely simulated war. Amir Mehdi Kazemi, Press TV, the port city of Josk at the coast of the Oman Sea.
Well, I believe we're going to join Amir Mehdi Kazemi himself, who is joining us live now from Josk for the latest on today's drills. Amir, what has been happening today?
Well, Wagar, today we are witnessing the fifth day of the Mohammad Rasulullah war games, which is considered as the largest ever military drill conducted by the Iranian ground, sea, and Air Force of the Iranian Army. Of course, we have already been updated by three major developments in today's drill that include the successful launch of the Noor and Nasr cruise missiles, which have been, according to the Iranian Army, completely built and designed by Iranian engineers, successfully hitting their targets from land to sea. And the other development includes the inauguration of SH-3D torpedo-laying helicopters that intercepted hypothetical enemies, and at the same time submarines rather at sea. They launched torpedoes and successfully managed to hit the hypothetical submarines of enemies at sea. Of course, it is worth mentioning that this has taken place for the very first time, and officially the torpedo-laying helicopters of Iran have now become operational and ready to protect the coastal line of the Islamic Republic. The third development also includes the operation of an integral aeronautical anti-aircraft radar system, which actually sends signals to the Iranian Air Force. In this case, Iranian jet fighters managed to successfully intercept hypothetical enemy targets using this integral and aeronautical radar detecting system, and have managed to successfully target different targets at sea and on land and in the air. Back to you, Lavar.
Okay, Amir, thanks very much for that detailed update. That was Amir Mehdi Kazemi, Press TV's correspondent, who was giving us the update on the continuing military drills by the Islamic Republic.
Russia and Iran sign a new military agreement allowing Russian jets to use an Iranian airbase for anti-ISIL missions in Syria.
In an unprecedented move, Russia has begun using an airbase in Iran to conduct bombing missions over Syria. The Russian Defense Ministry says its long-range bombers have carried out airstrikes against Daesh from the west of Iran at the Hamadan airbase. It's thought to be the first time Russian military aircraft have been deployed from Iranian soil in half a century.
Russia's defense ministry said that Moscow has deployed Russian bombers to an Iranian airbase to widen its campaign in Syria. But these bombers have already targeted militant targets in Syria. Well, Russia's defense ministry says that those are Tupolev 22 M3 long-range bombers and Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers, and they were launched from a Hamadan airbase in Iran. Well, according to reports, it's cheaper and quicker to fly them from Hamadan. This could reduce flying time by 60% and also could allow to increase the load on the plane. Before this, Russia was flying these bombers from its base in North Ossetia because its base in Latakia in Syria is not big enough for them. But flying time, the distance to Palmyra from North Ossetia is around 2,000 kilometers, whereas this distance to Palmyra from Hamadan is around 900 kilometers. But certainly Russia and Iran share similar goals in Syria, and they are allies in the region, and both Russia and Iran are part of the same coalition fighting Daesh in Syria.
International news now, where it seems there's increasing cooperation over Syria. It follows Iran allowing Russia to use an airbase, and now China saying it will offer military help to the Syrian government.
Learning that China is seeking closer military ties with Syria, a senior Chinese military official just visited Damascus, where he met with the Syrian defense minister. According to the agency, the Chinese and Syrian officials also talked about the possibility for China to provide military training and humanitarian aid to Syria. This talk about the possibility of China providing military training to Syrian government forces marks a change in China's more detached approach to the war in Syria. China had previously praised Russia's role there, but it may now provide more specific support to the fight against terrorists. The Chinese news agency also reported that while in Damascus, the Chinese military official also met with the Russian general. So you have a potential alliance forming not only with China, but also with Iran.
China and Russia are permanent members of what's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran wants to become a member. There's about 17 countries in all that either are permanent members, partners, which also include Turkey, Iran, India, Pakistan, and all the countries in Central Asia. It is a large organization. What's intriguing is that Russia is pivoting more toward the east.
Saber rattling. He promised to counter what he described as Russian aggression by increasing military buildup through NATO's presence near Russia. NATO, a key aspect of U.S. security policy. Now, the Baltic Sea region is quickly becoming a friction point between Russia, NATO, and the U.S., with NATO military exercises underway and a lot of close encounters. I was joined earlier by James Carden, Washington correspondent for The Nation magazine. He started by telling me for what NATO is preparing.
It was recently announced that NATO is going to be sending in 4,000 troops to Lithuania and Poland as part of the European Reassurance Initiative. That's a $3.4 billion initiative designed ostensibly to reassure our NATO allies in light of what has been happening in eastern Ukraine. In addition to that, the United States has sent in the USS Donald Cook, which is a missile-class destroyer about 50 miles away from Kaliningrad. Now, Kaliningrad, a lot of Americans don't know, is a Russian port between Poland and Lithuania, and they have a major naval base there. And so the effect of these maneuvers by the United States and NATO has been to increase tension in the region.
So what exactly is the aggression that they're worried about? I mean, this is a lot of militarized presence that they're gearing up for.
Yeah, what they claim to be very worried about is a repeat of what has happened in eastern Ukraine.
The entire Europe must calm down in the knowledge that the Pentagon would do anything in order to protect Europe from Russia. On Monday, the Pentagon deployed a pair of F-22 fighter jets to southeast Romania in an effort to deter hypothetical Russian aircraft. The US Air Force aircraft arrived at the airbase on the Black Sea, less than 400 kilometers away from the Russian military stronghold of Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. The US Air Force has deployed F-15 Eagle air superiority fighter aircraft to Iceland and the Netherlands. Several NATO countries as well as non-members, such as Finland and Sweden, are sending planes to Estonia for the first massive Air Force exercise to feature civilian airport aimed at training for interception of aircraft losing contact inside Finnish airspace. The two-day exercise called Ramstein Alo-1 will kick off at the Estonia's Amare Air Force Base next Thursday. It will be involving warplanes and air crews from Belgium, Spain and Poland, as well as non-NATO members such as Finland and Sweden.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is a direct message to the Department of Defense, all four branches of the military, active duty, service members, veterans, their families, state governments, local governments, and the media. We are going to display 100% irrevocable proof that there is a global move, not just here, but all over the world, to militarize police and to put standing armies on the streets to suppress the population and to carry out political operations.
It seems strange that at the same time when we have huge military drills, military hardware movement and FEMA training in the US, in Europe we have 600 members of various European military forces recently conducted an exercise in the German North Rhine province ready to be deployed in the event of civil unrest or war. Why in the world Italy's streets would be patrolled by Chinese police? That shows a very strong message that Vatican will be partially protected by China during a major crisis. Finland Defense Minister Jussi Niinistö said Russia doesn't pose a threat to his country. But then why would Finnish government send a reminder to 900,000 soldiers to prepare for war with Russia? Because it's a mind game tactic used by the mainstream media. On top of that, additional 40 guided multiple launch rocket systems and warhead rockets worth $150 million sold to Finland, just in case NATO stockpiles military hardware in Norway.
So we have what are called pre-position gear, both in caves and on ships, and it allows forces from the United States to come out and fall in on gear that is already forward deployed versus bringing all that gear with us.
M1A1 tanks, amphibious assault vehicles, artillery, and logistics equipment support NATO allies.
So any gear that is already forward deployed both reduces cost and speeds up our ability to support operations in crisis. So we're able to fall in on gear that is basically ready to go and respond to whatever that crisis may be.
It always takes time to deploy forces to a certain area. When you have material, equipment, prepositioned, you can fly in the personnel and you will be faster ready to conduct operations. So that's always an advantage to have that preposition in stocks in Norway.
The equipment will support Exercise Cold Response 16 starting later this month.
We fit easily together when we are operating. The last 10-15 years we have been operating together in Afghanistan, other places, and when you move to Norway you will always operate in 3 dimensions because we have a long coastline, we have land territory and the air.
President Obama is back at the White House this morning after a week in the Middle East and Europe. Air Force One touched down Monday evening at Joint Base Andrews outside Washington. We spoke with the president yesterday in Germany in a wide-ranging interview. He had just announced 250 more American troops will go to Syria. They will help in the fight against ISIS, also known as ISIL.
Us dismantling ISIL is a priority, and although we are not going to be sending ground troops in to fight, we are going to try to find out what works and then double down. And one of the things that's worked so far is us putting special forces in for training and advising of local forces, but also intelligence gathering.
Let me pivot to China. Your Secretary of Defense has been in the region. How aggressive do you see the action in the South China Sea? And do you worry that they will cross some line in which you'll have to respond more aggressively?
I've been consistent since I've been president in believing that a productive, candid relationship between the United States and China is vital, not just to our two countries, but to world peace and security. We're a lot better off with a China that feels confident.
It's not a zero-sum game.
It's not a zero-sum game. What is true, though, is that they have a tendency to view some of the immediate regional issues or disputes as a zero-sum game. So with respect to the South China Sea, rather than operate under international norms and rules, their attitude is we're the biggest kids around here and we're going to push aside the Philippines or the Vietnamese. But it doesn't mean that we're trying to act against China. We just want them to be partners with us, and where they break out of international rules and norms, we're going to hold them to account.
And what about North Korea, finally?
North Korea is a massive challenge. Our first priority is to protect the American people and our allies, Republic of Korea, Japan, that are vulnerable to the provocative actions that North Korea is engaging in. They are erratic enough. Their leader is personally irresponsible enough that we don't want them getting close. But it's not something that lends itself to an easy solution. We could obviously destroy North Korea with our arsenals, but aside from the humanitarian costs of that, they are right next door to our vital ally, Republic of Korea. One of the things that we have been doing is spending a lot more time positioning our missile defense systems so that even as we try to resolve the underlying problem of nuclear development inside of North Korea, we're also setting up a shield that can at least block the relatively low-level threats that they're posing right now.
President Obama has launched the EU's most massive military buildup close to Russian and Chinese borders. This piece of information clearly shows a very strong message of the beginning of a major conflict between major superpowers such as NATO, Russia and China. As you're watching this video, we have missile defense shields being set up and being installed in Israel, in North Korea, Eastern Europe and Russia. When United States is testing its new intercontinental ballistic missiles. We have Canada asking to join US missile shield to enhance national security. Canada has suggested it may join the US missile defense shield. Then we have the installation of the US missile shield in Eastern Europe along Russian border. Russia has opposed US and NATO plans to deploy anti-missile systems close to borders with Russia. Washington says that the anti-missile system would not threaten Russian security. Russia will restore a missile attack warning station near Crimea to counter an increasing NATO activity in the Black Sea. We have 4,000 cruise missiles pointed at Putin that would enable Obama to deliver precision-guided non-nuclear airstrikes anywhere inside Russia in less than an hour. When Putin calling Obama's new missile shield in Eastern Europe along Russian border a direct threat, we have Poland setting up a new missile shield. And then we have Romania setting up a new missile shield. We have US anti-missile base in Poland put by Obama, and in Kaliningrad we have Putin threatening to put nuclear missiles there. We have Putin activating S-400 defense systems all around Russian border with Eastern Europe, and we have nuclear missile systems patrolling Moscow streets. We have Norway and the US planning to establish a new military radar post in Vardø, Finnmark, in addition to the already existing US Globus 2 radar system. Let me show you on the map where all the missile defense shields are being set up and being installed in Eastern Europe. Just look at this map. Here we have Putin in Moscow, placing S-400 defense systems all around Moscow, and we have some in Kaliningrad. Here we have Obama setting up a missile defense shield in Poland and Romania, and putting radars in Norway. And in all these countries we have NATO and US military training at unprecedented scale. Watch my new video on military training and military hardware movement by Putin and by Obama in these countries. The link to my new video, as always, will be below in the description box. Just a little bit more than 70 years ago, we had a great war between major superpowers. Today, in the same place, on the same map, we have the same superpowers in the face of NATO and Russia preparing for a major war. Just remember, only a little bit more than 70 years ago, in the same place on this map, millions and millions of people died fighting for the same forces that are preparing a major conflict today. My biggest concern is that during World War II, there was no nuclear weapons available in such a big amount that is available today. And in the same place on this map, there was no nuclear power plants, so the war was limited in scope.
While the Allied forces lost hundreds of thousands of citizens during the course of the conflict, at least 27 million Soviets were killed during what's known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. The Eastern Front also proved the deadliest for Nazi Germany, with 74% of their war deaths occurring there. Almost every single Soviet family suffered the horrors of this war. Only 37% of all men drafted to the front line survived till the end of the conflict.
Now I want you to pay close attention to this information. Washington continues to prepare a global strike, according to the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation. the United States continue its destabilizing activities. This includes the creation of a global missile defense system, the continuation of the development of tools capable of inflicting a disarming strike without using nuclear weapons. The Rapid Global Attack System of the United States provides the establishment of a hypersonic system which will be able to apply high-precision non-nuclear strikes from American territory at targets on Earth within an hour. This system will cause a non-nuclear strike, disarming strategic nuclear forces, including those of Russia. 24 generals from 13 NATO countries gather in Latvia to train joint operations. We are prepared to fight and win if we have to. NATO's focus will expand from assurance to deterrence, including measures that vastly improve NATO's overall readiness. Lithuania is hosting large-scale military exercises involving the country's forces as well as soldiers from other NATO member states. Another Baltic state, Estonia, started a major military drills involving NATO troops in the country's regions near the Russian-Estonian border. NATO is deploying an additional 4 battalions of 4,000 troops in Poland and the 3 Baltic states. Do you remember when we had in the news saying that NATO would deploy 4,000 troops to the Baltic states? And when the next day that figure increased to 4,000 NATO troops being deployed to the Baltic states. Poland is set to double size of its armed forces. The Polish army will be bigger. We envision a substantial increase in the size of the army by at least 50%. Poland's armed forces, which currently have around 95,000 personnel, would grow to 150,000 personnel. Poland launched an ambitious 10-year defense project aimed at upgrading its military forces. According to Deputy Defense Minister Czesław Mroczek, in April 2016, Poland would choose a supplier of anti-missile defense system, which will reportedly cost around $10 billion. In total, Poland was planning to spend around $42 billion on its military upgrade over the next 10 years. Poland's military modernization program includes a missile defense shield, anti-aircraft systems, submarines, combat drones, armored personnel carriers. The Georgian army has begun the 2-week Nobel partner military exercises together with American and British forces.
We're already going under a form of martial law. So let me show you some of the news we already went to in our earlier report, then I'll go to a smattering of the other evidence right here. Much of it from the Department of Defense's own website. You have massive military gear being cached, armored vehicles, machine guns, helicopters, night vision, Humvees, with the police departments around the country. California has gotten the majority of it, along with Oklahoma and other areas to population. Texas has gotten double what California's gotten, and we have 10 million less than them. Oklahoma got basically double what California got, even though the crime rates are very low, because it's about suppressing the patriot population, just like they have on the map in Jade Helm showing Texas, Utah, and other areas as hostile. This is pre-caching to fight real Americans that won't go along with gun confiscation, you name it. Now, when you see Infowars.com articles I'm going to show you, you can go directly to the site, click on it, and go to the Department of Defense's site. DoD training manual, extremist founding fathers would not be welcome in today's military. Close quote. Army-sponsored report suggests new police force. That's WorldNet Daily. What's that out of? A stability police force for the United States, RAND Corporation. This is the martial law plan that I've been covering for 18 years. War gear flows to police departments, New York Times. Feds preparing to invade Texas, list state as hostile. They are preparing, not saying they're going to invade or take over. They are preparing for the takeover. And that's in the John Warren Defense Authorization Act of 96-97. They admit for insurrection by legislatures and governors. They just hope, just like Obamacare, you don't actually go read this stuff.
Obamacare is great, and it's really working. we have to make sure America writes the rules of the global economy. Because if we don't write the rules for trade around the world, guess what? China will.
Why in the world we would have such strange things happening on the land of freedom? What is very strange is that we have FEMA conducting biggest drills ever inside the US. We have all those FEMA executive orders set in place. We have Walmarts closed and being converted into detention centers according to some videos on YouTube. We have an unprecedented military hardware movement inside the US. We have this movie Armageddon coming out on Friday the 13th. We have another movie called X-Men Apocalypse. We have FEMA and DHS conducting riot control drills. On top of that, do you remember those articles saying that DHS has purchased more than 2 billion rounds of ammunition, which is enough to fight a war for 10 years? Do you remember those articles saying that US government has purchased 30,000 guillotines? Do you remember red, blue, green lists? Do you remember FEMA coffins? When at the same time we have US and NATO setting up and activating missile defense shields in Eastern Europe, on Russia's doorstep also in North Korea and inside the US. What do you think? Please share your thoughts by leaving a comment below this video.
Even the most casual observers of the news will have noticed the increasingly bellicose military rhetoric and provocations emerging from both China and the US over control of the Asia-Pacific.
China's Defense Ministry spokesman Yang Yujun said today that some countries, quote-unquote, were making tensions in the Asia-Pacific worse.
The United States confirmed that it flew 2 B-52 bombers over China's newly established air defense zone, as well as the disputed Diaoyu Islands.
China has sent fighter jets to its newly declared air zone in the East China Sea. Beijing says the jets flew into the air defense identification zone to strengthen monitoring on targets in the area.
But behind this conflict is another narrative, one of cooperation, agreements, political coordination, and business arrangements that have created a close tie between China and the US.
A commitment to cooperation. General Fan Changlong, the vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission, and American General Raymond Odierno oversee the signing of an army-to-army agreement on Friday. The deal, they say, will help improve coordination on a number of issues, like humanitarian relief, disaster response, and the fight against terrorism.
Military-to-military exchanges between the two sides have seen some progress in the past year as the two sides committed to a new model of military relations.
This is the second time the trilateral exercise has taken place. This year, involving 30 soldiers and Marines working closely together in the hot and dry Northern Territory wild. The 30 military personnel include 10 from the Australian Army, 10 from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, 5 from the U.S. Army, and 5 from the U.S. Marine Corps.
What is the truth behind this story of conflict and cooperation? Is this a genuine rivalry, a smokescreen being used to distract the public, or a little bit of both? Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization explains.
China is, in some regards, an industrial colony. I use that quote unquote, but at the same time, it is an upcoming power on the global stage. And I should mention that emerged also in the wake of the Cold War, where China's alignments vis-a-vis particularly vis-a-vis the Russian Federation, had changed dramatically to what they were in the during the Cold War era, and in the late 90s, particularly in the wake of the death of Deng Xiaoping and the demise of and the change of government in the Russian Federation. In other words, when Vladimir Putin became president, there we have a consolidation of an alliance between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China, the development of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and so on and so forth. And another very important dimension in the late 90s, ironically, just after Deng Xiaoping passed, there's an increased confrontation in the Taiwan Straits. Of course, there was always confrontation in the Taiwan Straits, but then it was at that point that China developed its military cooperation agreements with Russia and started to build up a naval facilities in the South China Sea to counteract U.S. threats. And then, of course, we had a very major shift in geopolitical relations. I would say as of the late 90s, early 2000, early 21st century, which is increasingly towards confrontation between China and the United States. But I should qualify that, because when you go to China, you have a very pro-American intelligentsia, the peoples in the universities and so on. The School of Journalism of Tsinghua University is supported by Bloomberg. People at the Academy of Social Sciences are very much tied into Western values and so on and so forth. So that, in fact, I would say the leadership is very much divided. America is very visible. Western capital is very visible throughout China, but at the same time, it's more at the geopolitical level that there's confrontation. And I think that the Chinese say, well, we're a capitalist economy in our own right. We're not going to be a subordinate colony of the West. But if you look at the actual mechanics of foreign trade, they still are, because they're producing commodities for the world market, and they are sort of feeding the non-productive structures of Western capitalism. If we go back in history, I would say that the West, in a sense, facilitated regime change in China. There's no question about it. It's difficult to research, but Henry Kissinger in 1972, then the Gang of Four, and so on, there was a transition towards a reintegration into Western capitalism. Okay, and that transition was implemented by a dominant clique within the Communist Party. Now that clique is still there. There's no question about it. But there are other areas of Chinese society which are firmly anti-American, and certainly within the military, the People's Army, the situation is dramatically different, and at the same time, there's a rather destructive shift in U.S. foreign policy, which is, I think, really motivated by the realignment of China with Russia under the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. Okay, what they want to do is essentially to break that alliance, and that alliance is, in a sense, is quite fragile, because the United States and Western countries, let's say Western capitalism, but also Japanese capitalism, are fairly well entrenched into the fabric of the banking system in China and so on.
That the United States is uniquely positioned to play a leading role in the Asia Pacific because of our history, our capabilities, and our credibility. People look to us, as they have for decades. The most common thing that Asian leaders have said to me in my travels over this last 20 months is, thank you. We're so glad that you're playing an active role in Asia again. Because they look to us to help create the conditions for broad, sustained economic growth and to ensure security by effectively deploying our own military.
The move to create a permanent U.S. military presence in Australia is a show of solidarity and force, when the president said America now has
the presence that's necessary to maintain the security architecture in the region.
What he means is an American troop presence in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and soon 2,500 Marines and potentially dozens of U.S. Air Force aircraft in Australia to serve as a counterweight to China.
We are here to stay. This is a region of huge strategic importance to us.
Well, I think that really, if you look at the U.S. standpoint, which is one of world domination, there's a military agenda, there's an economic agenda of dominating the world. And they've succeeded in dominating a large part of the world, where they have their own puppet regimes, their proxy regimes all over, which essentially obey orders and accept the consensus that the United States and its allies are the dominant powers in the world. Now, the Chinese will not do that. That's very, very clear. They won't do that. They're doing it in the way I've described through joint ventures and this, that, and other, but they're not going to accept a U.S. hegemonic project in Asia and the Far East. And people who know Chinese history will realize it's called the Middle Kingdom. It establishes its boundaries within certain realm, and it is they will not accept any kind of territorial encroachment. Now, you're not going to conquer this country in any way, and the question, I think U.S. policymakers want to subdue China. Perhaps they're not doing it the right way. They'll never be able to encroach on their territory in the same way as they encroach on the territory of Iraq or Syria. But having said that, let's bear in mind that there are dirty tricks on the part of the U.S. in supporting insurgencies. Of course, in Tibet, it's well understood. They're supporting a separatist insurgency, but they're also supporting insurgencies in the western provinces, the Xinjiang province and the Uyghur Autonomous Region, where you have a large Muslim population. And there, what are they doing? They're supporting Al-Qaeda-affiliated organizations, which are essentially, under the helm of the CIA, creating terrorist events and so on and so forth. So there is that kind of inroad, and there's also, and there has been for a very long time, I can say for a very long time, there has been a plan on the drawing board to fragment China, to cut China into different republics, so to speak, particularly South China, North China, Tibet, the western provinces, and so on. So that option has been there, and that option is very similar to what they've been trying to do in the Middle East, but they're dealing with a very different polity and social reality, and also and a misunderstanding of Chinese history going back to the Ming Dynasty. So there we are. That is the groundwork. Is that now what is at stake is essentially to curb the Chinese tiger, so to speak. Is that the Chinese economy has served the Western market economy for the last 30 or more years, since the early 80s. And now what Western leaders want to do is to ensure that tiger does not accede to the status of a global capitalist entity, which would challenge the hegemony of the United States and Western Europe and so on. And the thing is, of course, from a military standpoint, China is a nuclear power. It has a very advanced weapon system, and it has been developing that weapon system very carefully together with its Russian ally, and that I think is another dimension of this discussion and debate, is that if there is a confrontation with either Russia or China, we're in a very dangerous situation. This could lead to a world war. But at this stage, with regard to China, I don't think that this is likely to happen. It's much more focused on Russia at this particular point. But the threats directed against China in the South China Sea, I think, are intended to weaken China's relationship to Russia. But in fact, as you pointed out, that may in fact do exactly the opposite. It will reinforce the military alliance between Russia and China.
An investigation by the Philippine military has shown that Chinese leaders are busy staking their claim in disputed waters. And sources tell NHK some of the reclamation projects in the South China Sea could be used for military purposes. NHK has obtained reconnaissance photos the Philippine military took earlier this year near the Spratly Islands. The images show the Chinese have started reclaiming 2 new locations, one at Mischief Reef and another at Subi Reef. Philippine military sources say China has developed at least 1 square kilometre of the 7 locations it's been working on. For example, strips of shoal that were underwater in September at Fiery Cross Reef have been reclaimed. The area is now 3 kilometres long and 200 to 600 metres wide. Philippine military sources say crews are constructing a runway. And they say workers have been racing to put up large complexes, such as a 6-storey building at 4 other locations, including Gavin Reef and Johnson Reef. Our sources tell us the types of facilities and China's recent maritime activities suggest the reclamation projects could be used for military purposes. They say the facilities could start opening by year's end. Chinese authorities say the development is happening in waters under their control. But the Philippines, Vietnam and other parties have competing claims in the South China Sea. US officials have expressed their concerns over China's activities in the region. China's foreign minister referred to the Spratly project in Beijing over the weekend. Wang Yi said no one should challenge what China does in its own backyard.
Sydney is Tim Johnston. He's the Asia Programme Director at the International Crisis Group. Tim Johnston, very good to have you with us. What do you make of these drills, first and foremost? What's your stance on that?
Well, it's worth noting, Jane, that these are annual drills. They do hold them every year, although it looks as though this year they have brought them forward by about 3 weeks. And I don't think that's a coincidence ahead of next Tuesday's verdict. I think there are a couple of other things that are significant. I think the fact that they're being held north of the Paracel Islands, it's the least contested part of the South China Sea, although after last year they do seem to have shifted them slightly south and west. So I think this is making a statement, but it's not quite as belligerent a statement as they might make if, for instance, they decided to do it much further south near either the Scarborough Shoal, which is claimed by the Philippines, or the Spratlys, which has multiple claimants.
How dangerous is the situation in the South China Sea, considering all the players involved, considering all the claims? What are we really looking at here, realistically?
There are 5 main countries contending. You've got the Philippines, you've got China, of course, Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia, standing on the edge. Malaysia does have a territorial claim. And then you've got the US running the 7th Fleet on their freedom of navigation operations. So there are a lot of moving parts. And I think as you see economies starting to slow in Asia, nationalism is going to rise. And that's going to make it a much more volatile situation. It's going to be much harder for anyone to back down. And China has very much nailed its colours to the mast on this one. It says its 9-dash line, this big loop that runs south from the Chinese coast and takes almost the whole of the China Sea up. They've said that that is their sovereign territory. They haven't quite defined what that means in terms of allowing other people access, allowing cargo ships access. Somewhere between a third and a quarter of the world's cargo goes through the South China Sea. So I think it's very volatile. I think, having said that, that no one around the South China Sea wants to go to war.
It's
a question of whether they can find a comfortable place to stop. Because certainly at the moment
there's a
they
frustrating
are looking
delay here,
at
Tim.
a more sort of conflict-prone stance.
How important do you think the court case is at the international court? How pivotal is that to what's happening at the moment?
I think it is pivotal, but I think it's worth noting what it will not do. What it won't do is sort out the very difficult questions about sovereignty in the South China Sea. What it will do is it will decide whether, particularly these islands that China has been building in the South China Sea, whether they deserve a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, whether they deserve a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. So I think it will clarify the situation, but also the flexibility that we have nowadays is sometimes a good thing because it means that people aren't locked in. This is going to make it harder to ignore. So I think it could go both ways. And I think the fact that China hasn't pushed the button harder with these exercises is probably a good sign. But we'll have to wait until after Tuesday's rulings to see exactly what effect it has on the broader geostrategic implications in the South China Sea.
And that we shall do. Thank you, Tim Johnston.
The start of 2016 has witnessed a sharp escalation in the militarization of the South China Sea. The cause of the escalation is multifaceted and comes from both regional and international quarters. The militarization has been initiated and exacerbated by both China and the United States, both bearing responsibility for the current level of tension in the region. The USS John C. Stennis Carrier Strike Group sailed to the region from its home port in Bremerton, Washington on January 15th and passed through the Luzon Strait separating Taiwan and the Philippines on March the 1st. The Stennis is accompanied by the guided missile cruisers, the USS Antietam and the USS Mobile Bay, as well as the guided missile destroyers USS Stockdale and USS Chung Hoon. The Antietam is based at Yokosuka, Japan, and was ordered off its normal patrol to join the Carrier Strike Group. The 7th Fleet flagship, the USS Blue Ridge, is also in the area, having docked in Manila on March the 4th. Trilateral talks were held on board the Blue Ridge on March the 5th between the US Navy, Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, and the Philippine Navy. The key subject of discussion was how the three nations can work together to confront China in the South China Sea, promote security and stability in the region, and develop future multilateral training and exercises. The current deployment of the Stennis CSG to the region follows the previous deployment of the USS Lanson guided missile destroyer to the Spratly Islands last October, and the USS Curtis Wilbur to the Paracel Islands in late January of this year. The US has also increased surveillance flights over the areas by P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, as well as in one case B-52 strategic bombers. The navies of China and Vietnam fought a naval engagement for control of the Paracel Islands in 1974, which resulted in China's de facto control of the islands. China has established a military presence on Woody Island since that time, and has engaged in an extensive expansion of the base in recent years. Woody Island now has an extensive military airbase with a number of newly built hangars and munition storage buildings. In February, satellite surveillance revealed the deployment of 2 batteries of HQ-9 surface-to-air missile launchers, as well as supporting vehicles such as an engagement radar and the Type 305B ASAR acquisition radar on the northern end of the island. Last November, China announced the deployment of J-11 fighters to Woody Island. As land reclamation and building efforts on the part of the Chinese continue at Fiery Cross Reef and Mischief Reef in the Spratly Islands, with no signs of slowing down in the immediate future, it will be interesting to see if the US Navy increases the size and tempo of future patrols in the area. With the Royal Australian Navy taking delivery of its second Canberra-class LHD, HMAS Adelaide, on December the 4th of last year, and the first of two Makassar-class LPD vessels built by Indonesia for the Philippine Navy, the BRP Tarlac, launched on January 17th of this year, the US Navy may soon be bolstered by more powerful regional navies in future patrols. The Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, announced in November of last year his willingness to have the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces join the US Navy in patrols of the South China Sea. Australian P-3 Orion Maritime Patrol aircraft are currently flying freedom of navigation missions in the region. It was reported just days ago on March the 9th that the United States and Australia were negotiating the basing of more US strategic bombers, including the supersonic B-1 and aerial tankers, at Australian bases on a rotational basis. The aircraft would be based at Tyndall and Darwin in northern Australia. They would complement US B-52 strategic bombers already based at Darwin on a similar rotation. As the brinkmanship continues, with no signs of either China or the United States backing down, the chances of a military confrontation in the South China Sea, whether calculated or accidental, continue to grow with each passing day.
U.S. naval services have released a new maritime strategy, a plan that describes how the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard will design, organize, and employ naval forces in support of its global dominance. The new strategy, titled A Cooperative Strategy for the 21st Century Superpower, highlighted forward, engaged, and ready as key words and kept the original theme of ensuring our capability to intervene overseas. It calls for increasing the Navy's forward presence to 120 ships by 2020, up from about 97 ships today. This includes forward-basing 4 ballistic missile defense destroyers in Spain and stationing another attack submarine in Guam by the end of 2015. The Navy is scheduled to increase presence in the Middle East from 30 ships today to 40 by 2020. The strategy reinforces the continued need to strengthen the partnerships and alliances by stressing the importance of operating in NATO maritime groups and participating in international training exercises. The U.S. strategy emphasizes operating forward and making proxies across the globe, especially in the Indo-Asian Pacific region. Thus, the hard anti-Russian rhetoric of Washington is a sign of the global standoff. At the very same time, the United States is preparing to go deeper in deal with China. The U.S. strategists are concerned about rise of Chinese naval forces and its expansion to the Pacific Ocean. Particularly, they aim to prevent a situation where China will be able to defend particular zones of sea communications from foreign intervention. This is Chinese DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles purpose. In 2008, the U.S. Department of Defense estimated that China had 60 to 80 missiles and 60 launchers. The risk of establishing area-denied operational environment, for instance, in the South China Sea, worries architects of the strategy. Since the American pivot towards Asia, a tolerant term for the U.S. deterrence policy against China, in 2011, the United States Navy has deployed 60% of all of its powers in Asian-Pacific region. Indeed, it's ready to deploy even more in order to establish its own control in China's zone of interest. Armed with its own unparalleled navy, the U.S. gets a louder voice and more power to restrict military or economy use of the oceans by other countries. In other words, it indicates the U.S. intention to control the trade in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, or even monopolize it in those waters. Now here's where the problem is. In April, China overtook the United States as the world's top importer of crude oil, and 80% of this oil, and many other important resources, China imports through the Malacca Strait, which the Chinese Navy doesn't control. In this context, it's clear why Beijing claims sovereignty over nearly all of the South China Sea, and is building a military base in Djibouti. China supports counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, conducts humanitarian assistance and disaster response missions enabled by its hospital ship, and participates in large-scale, multinational naval exercises. Washington immediately protested against the China-Djibouti relations and expressed concern over China's plans to build a military base in the Obok region, but to no avail. China has to defend the supply of oil over a long way and isn't able to do it right now. Problem is, it doesn't have enough naval bases along vital shipping lines as of yet. Strings of Pearls strategy, initially suggested as a series of seaports and naval bases stretching along the Indian Ocean, has to resolve this issue. The seaports will be support places and investments that could pay dividends on a strategic level while causing broader security amenities. China's naval defense strategy is grounded on the combination of offshore waters defense with open seas protection concepts. The offshore waters defense consists of 2 missions. One is to protect China's eastern coastal area, which is the country's most economically vibrant region. The other is to ensure the safety of the expanding shipping lines that are vital to China's economic growth. Open seas protection concept also has 2 elements. One is to extend maritime protection to waters over 600 miles from the Chinese coast by building supply depots in the disputed South China Sea, trying to conduct submarine activities in the Indian Ocean, and acquiring bases beyond the region. The other is to develop capabilities to conduct non-conventional security operations outside the region, such as naval diplomacy, joint maritime law enforcement, and humanitarian assistance. Compared with the United States, the PLA Navy has sufficient self-defense capabilities, but deficiency in cross-region operations and force projection is evident, though Beijing is trying to change that. On the other side, China's unique geographical location allows it to establish control over its local seas, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. That is what the United States has accused China of doing in the last 5 to 10 years. The so-called anti-access area denial A2, AD, or the 4 short fleece strategy. This is the real reason for the boiling over for China's island work in the South China Sea. Washington is sufficiently alarmed by a perspective to lose the maritime control in the region and has started the naval force race under an umbrella term of all domain access. Despite this, Beijing is adamant. In June, China said it was shifting work on disputed South China Sea islands from the dredging of land to the construction of military and other facilities. The U.S. containment policy against China includes not only holding of old alliances, but a creating of new. In the recent strategy, Washington pledges to strengthen cooperation with 6 long-standing allies: Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the Philippines, the Republic of Korea, and Thailand, and also lists 8 new partners: Bangladesh, Brunei, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Micronesia, Pakistan, Singapore, Vietnam. With help of its Asian allies, the U.S. are going to seal off the PLA Navy in South China Sea and prevent its moving into operational space. Further, Washington's diplomatic rhetoric over the long-standing allies, shared strategic interests, and cooperation in Asia, in fact, is aimed at establishing a coalition against China. Despite the fact that the U.S. official strategy is ignoring the Taiwan issue, the island may easily become a flashpoint of ongoing confrontation, and the Western media machine has already set the ground for it. On July 22nd, U.S. magazine The Diplomat reported that the People's Liberation Army soldiers were seen running towards a building that bears a striking resemblance to the Japanese-built presidential office in Taipei. During the Series C of this year's Live Fire Stride 2015 Zurich military exercises, the magazine argues 2 things. First is that PLA is practicing the storming of the presidential office to bring pressure on Taiwan in the context of its presidential and legislative elections in January 16, 2016. Second is Chinese military has been preparing to invade the island, but the fact should be taken in its proper context. The military drills are a signal not for Taiwan, but for the US. China shows its capacity to solve a Taiwan problem by force, to predict an attempt to use the island for strengthening of the US military presence. Also, aggressive activity of US special services through Taiwan or an economic sabotage threatening it. In other cases, Beijing would much prefer to reintegrate Taiwan without having to resort to force, but by cultural, economic and political tools. Moreover, it already has a successful experience of lost territories reintegration, Macau and Hong Kong. Another area of the US-China geopolitical confrontation is the Indian Ocean. US strategists, media outlets and public experts argue India is a rival state for China. Monetary wealth and power growth of both states will result in inevitable clashes between them.
I'm Carrie Gracie. My guest today is a diplomat, Sha Zukang, Chinese ambassador to the United Nations.
Talking about Taiwan, it's a fact that Taiwan is a part and parcel of China. It has always been part of China. Taiwan is the most important issue. That is to say, this issue on which we don't have any room for compromise.
But why don't you just shrug and let the Taiwanese do their own thing?
Well, I think for any sovereign country in the world today, no country will tolerate, the division of the country forever. We are product of history, product of civilization. That's the way we look at it. And according to United Nations Charter, the sovereignty, territorial integrity is the most sacred thing. It should be protected. We treat territorial integrity more important than our lives. It's a very pragmatic approach. No force on the world can shake Chinese nation's determination to achieve the unification of my great motherland. Let me say, the moment it declares independence by Taiwan, supported by whoever, China will have no choice. We'll do the business through whatever means available to my government. Nobody should have illusion on that.
This obsession about Taiwan, it constrains your foreign policy. It forces you into straitjacket of talking about certain kinds of reactions which would inevitably, profoundly damage the economic development that's been so central to the Chinese project for the past 30 years.
Economic development, we want it. Because without economic development, you cannot do anything else. It's very, very important. China is a developing country. To improve the standard of living of our people is the priority job of my government.
And yet, if you go to war over Taiwan,
then we go to war, but if we have to choose between sovereignty, territorial integrity, and economic development, we will choose the maintenance of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is the other core interest. But once we have achieved, this integrity, we still have time to build our economy. But if China is forced to choose, I told you, we'll choose the territorial integrity.
Well, it's a high price to pay for a few square kilometers.
Yes,
miles from
you
the
are
coast.
right. You are right. I said at any cost. It's not a matter of how big Taiwan is, how useful it is. But for China, 1 inch of the territory is more valuable than the life of our people. We will never concede on that.
About military might. China's leaders talk about peaceful development. Why then is China building up its military forces so assertively?
China's military power or build-up military power is very much exaggerated. China is a huge country which, like any sovereign country, is entitled to national defense. And our military budget is very moderate, particularly in terms of per capita income. It's very, very low in the world.
And yet the American Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says that China is spending more than the government acknowledges, that it's expanding its missile capabilities, developing advanced military technology, and he says, why pour all this money into the military at a time when China needs as much as it can for its economic development, at the same time as China faces no threat from any other country? That's the American position.
We don't need anyone to preach and teach us, and no one in the world is qualified to teach and preach China. And the United States, as far as the military business is concerned, U.S. is the least qualified guy to preach and teach China, because it has the biggest military arsenal in the world. It's the most advanced technology and science technology for their military build-up. It has the biggest military budget, yet this guy is telling us, China, you should stop. It's not in your interest. Okay, it's better for U.S. to shut up. Keep quiet. It's much, much better. China, the military build-up is not threatening anyone. It's for legitimate defense. If you don't have any ambitions, you should not be afraid of. You read our history. China have not sent any. So we are not fighting anywhere. We are not killing the innocent people anywhere in the world today. But look what they are doing today. So, and we have to be careful. Careful to make sure no one in the world can harm China. We are determined to defend our country. With little bit military increase, they are trying to make a huge story about it. I want to tell U.S. that, are you the number one? Is it true that you have almost 50% of the world military budget? And why do you have that? And China's population is 6 times or 5 times that of the United States. China's territory is as big as the United States. Why blame China? No, forget it. It's high time to shut up. Don't preach and teach China. I'm sorry, because I'm being not diplomatic in using my language.
Well, it's quite interesting, isn't it?
But I feel very strongly about it.
Yes, and it clearly makes you angry.
We don't have any soldier abroad. We are not killing anyone. Look what the way they are doing in the world today, right? So, China is threatening. China's build-up is not in China's interest. Who knows China better? China itself knows it better. China is not a member of any military alliance. Look, being a superpower, it is building up all kinds of alliances in the world today. For the defense of the territory of the United States? Right. Don't tell us anyway. It's U.S.'s sovereign right to do whatever they deem good for them. But don't tell us what is good for China. Thank you very much. Our military capability is exclusively for the self-defense, to make sure to deter those who dare to harm China.
Since September the 11th, America has seemed locked into its war on terror. One might believe that American diplomatic horizons stop at the suburbs of Baghdad or Kabul. But while focusing on the vestiges of the World Trade Center, the country is secretly preparing for a new conflict, an undeclared war, but one that is the top priority for the intelligence community and the White House. Ahead of Al-Qaeda, more important than the quagmire in Iraq, the Chinese threat, America's new war.
They have a term they call comprehensive national power, which is economic, political, military, all together, cultural. And they say this is the essence of China. This is the time for China to rise. Our time has come. This is the Tang Dynasty again. We are a great power. We are a world power. They are playing the old Sun Tzu game, winning the fight without firing a bullet, or that isn't what Sun Tzu said, but win the battle without losing men. That's the best way of winning. And I think they're very conscious of this, but they're willing to fight.
The world will, run by three first-class countries. One is USA, United States of America. Another is USE, United States of Europe. Then the Greater China. At this point, at the current point, I think the possibility to see a USE is very slim. But the USA stay as top one country is something sure, right? And as for the possibility of Greater China, the possibility is something in between. Right? So I tend to think Sino-US relations will be one of the most important bilateral ties in the coming years. And this bilateral tie will decide the nature of international relations in 21st century. If this bilateral tie is confrontation-oriented, then the whole 21st century will be bound by confrontation.
Kinmen Island, the actual frontier between the two giants, and where the ultimate confrontation may take place. This little island belongs to Taiwan, but it is only 2 kilometers from the Chinese coast. From here, one can see the inaccessible banks of Fujian province, where hundreds of ballistic missiles point at Taipei. "24 hours a day, for 60 years, Taiwan has been watching Communist China. This island, regularly threatened by Beijing, has been bombarded thousands of times. It has never surrendered. America has sent a message to Beijing. The fall of Kinmen would lead to a direct confrontation. We're in the Strait of Taiwan. It's here that a military clash might one day break out.
Taiwan is one of those emotional hot-button issues, the way Jerusalem is to Palestinians and Israelis, the way Kosovo was to the Albanians and Serbs. And for most mainland Chinese, Taiwan is rightfully a Chinese province. This was territory that they believe was stolen from China by Japan in the 1895 war, and that the United States prevented reunification during the early stages of the Cold War because of our opposition to communism.
In 1996, here in the Straits of Taiwan, China and America engaged in their biggest military standoff. The ongoing elections in Taiwan annoyed the regime in Beijing, so the Chinese army decided to launch huge military maneuvers to test the Americans' reaction. After several days of this Chinese show of force, Washington deployed 2 aircraft carriers. It was the first time the two countries came face to face. For several days, there was extreme tension between the two nuclear powers.
When the Chinese fired short-range ballistic nuclear-capable missiles off the north and south coast of Taiwan and carried out a major, what we call a live-fire exercise. And Jiang Zemin was there, the president. They were using some very belligerent language. This is when we dispatched 2 carrier battle groups off the East Coast. And this was a show, this was force. And the matter quickly dissipated.
The Chinese thought this was excessive. They thought that they had an understanding with the U.S., that they would have a limited display to show their seriousness on the issue. The U.S. would adopt a very limited response, and then they would both back away. They regarded the deployment of a second carrier as excessive and in some ways as humiliating to the Chinese, because the Chinese couldn't do much to deter or complicate the deployment of those carriers.
I know this story well, and I can tell you that the truth is very different from the American propaganda. I was there in 1996. The Americans had promised to send an aircraft carrier to Taiwan for Election Day to protect Taiwan. But actually, the only American ship near Taiwan was the electronic spy ship Bunker Hill. And it was more than 200 nautical miles away. And the first American aircraft carrier was 600 nautical miles from Taiwan. So the truth is that the Americans announced that they were coming, but they kept their distance. They wanted at all costs to avoid any incident, and they didn't dare approach our army.
Even if the Americans didn't take much of a risk, in the eyes of the world, they reaffirmed a sacred principle of their foreign policy. They support Taiwan. And they will continue to do so, regardless of China's growing power.
I think believes Taiwan is very important for a number of reasons, not to mention the fact that it's our 8th largest trading partner, our 6th largest market for agricultural goods. It's one of America's most important sources of high-tech semiconductor products. Even though they're imported to the United States via China, they're made in Taiwan. But that, of course, isn't the only thing. The real reason I think America has a commitment to Taiwan is because Taiwan is a democracy. It is, in fact, the most vibrant and dynamic democracy in East Asia. And it's a democracy that came to fruition under the pressure of the U.S. government, primarily the Congress, after 40 years of very tight authoritarian rule by a regime that came from mainland China. I think, however, the real reason that the United States, especially the Pentagon, is so concerned about Taiwan is that it has been a very strong defense and intelligence partner for the last 50 years, including the last 30 years since the breaking of relations with the Republic of China and Taiwan. We have still maintained a very strong defense relationship and a very strong intelligence collection relationship with Taiwan.
I would say the United States is committed to Taiwan. This goes back historically a long, long way. World War II, we were there. And we were looking for a strong, unified, democratic China. Well, we got 2/3 of it. Strong and unified, not democratic. Now we're calling China a responsible stakeholder. We've got half of it. We've got a stakeholder, but not a responsible one yet. The U.S. feels that we have an obligation, legal, moral, to Taiwan, that we cannot stand idly by and let this be taken over by what looks like an authoritarian, communist-influenced power. This cannot be.
Taiwan, an island of 23 million inhabitants, 250 kilometers from the Chinese coast, is today the most explosive strategic issue between China and the United States. Taipei, the capital, flaunts its economic success. It is one of the biggest centers in the world for the electronics industry. A modern city, free, young, and always noisy. In 1895, Taiwan was invaded by Japan. 50 years later, after the Japanese defeat, peace treaties returned the territory to China, a China which was then in the midst of a civil war between Mao's communists and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. When the battle turned in Mao's favor, General Chiang Kai-shek, aided by the Americans, took refuge in Taiwan with his soldiers. Since then, two Chinese governments have coexisted. In Beijing, the communist regime that controls the entire mainland. And in Taipei, the nationalist regime, having become little by little a democracy, calling itself the Republic of China, which rules only Taiwan. Officially, these two governments both claim to be the legitimate representatives of all the Chinese. Taiwan is not recognized as a state by the UN. Only 20 small countries maintain diplomatic relations with the island. A fragile independence, while Beijing still considers Taiwan as the 23rd province of the People's Republic, a rebel province that the regime intends to reunite with the motherland.
I would say two major motivations. There are many others, but two major ones. The first one is national pride, unification of China. They are committed to this. This is a strong emotional drive in China. And you don't downplay it. It's real. It's powerful. The second is strategic. They know through history, if Taiwan is in unfriendly hands, that China is very badly affected.
If you turn the globe around, and if you were the Navy commander of the Chinese armed forces, then you will see the only way to protect my coastline is to extend our defense and power projection capability far away from our territory. Why I need to do that? Because the economic center, financial center, education center, production center of today's China is all on the coastline. So the Navy's mission is to make sure that nobody touched this so I can continue to grow. To go out, you have a big stone right there. You can go other places, but there is a stopper, a stone blocking your way, and that's Taiwan.
Now, Taiwan depends on the outcome of elections that could change its executive power and stock market risks that can endanger its economy. Beijing, nevertheless, has understood that whatever the mood on the island, especially when it is favorable to political reconciliation, the strategy must never change. Imperturbable, the communist regime continues. On one hand, to offer Taiwan favorable business privileges on the mainland. On the other hand, it regularly reiterates its military threats. If the Taiwanese are too insistent about their desire for independence, they're going to have to fight for it. Whatever Taiwan's political tendencies, Beijing's position doesn't change one iota. A freeway in the middle of the island of Taiwan. In a few minutes, it has been transformed into a landing strip. The population watches this military exercise. They're used to it. French Mirage 2000 and American F-16 jets land and take off with an enormous roar. Faced with the uncertainty of American support, Taiwan organizes its own defense. Everyone knows that the airports will be the first target. Strategists on both sides of the strait affirm that the war will first begin with an air battle.
I think that experts the world over know that it's very difficult to succeed with an invasion. We still remember Normandy. In a strait like ours, it's what's in the air that will make the difference. And we've always tried to keep a strategic advantage over China, our air superiority. But with the Chinese missiles, this equilibrium has been put into question. They can destroy our airports, and if they are destroyed, we lose our only advantage over China, our air superiority.
Taiwan's military power is concentrated in its air force, but also in special ground forces. They are training to face the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In the event of a conflict, they expect elite Chinese troops to parachute onto the island to attack strategic targets.
Every Taiwanese people here knows that when the war comes, Taiwan is going to take the first bullet. We are going to take the first bullet, and probably we're going to take the bullets continue for about 2 weeks until a month, until that the United States coming. And there's no way that U.S. will come here to fight a difficult fight. If they really want to get involved, it's better for them that to wait when the Taiwanese people, we are wearing down the Chinese elite troops and give them the huge number of the sacrifice. And then the U.S. can come in and clean out the battlefield and win an easy fight. Everybody in Taiwan knows that.
In Washington, the scenario of the next confrontation is a constant preoccupation. They know that Chinese military power has increased significantly. But how the Pentagon will react in case of a new Taiwan crisis remains a mystery.
It's certainly not automatic, the support for Taiwan. It never has been. The United States has always maintained a policy of so-called strategic ambiguity, in which neither Beijing nor Taiwan can know clearly what the U.S. response might be under any given set of circumstances.
I think that 10 years later, from 1996, the missile crisis in the Taiwan Strait, to 2007, we would approach the Taiwan issue with a little bit more caution. We would approach the Taiwan issue with a lot more caution. What this means, I think, is that we would be probably resupplying Taiwan by air. We probably would put a active duty military contingent on Taiwan rather than risk putting our ships in harm's way.
Coming away from this crisis, the U.S. has concluded that I think there's been problems in what they've concluded. The U.S. has concluded that the Chinese were somewhat intimidated by the U.S. deployments, and that in fact they now know the U.S. is very determined to use force, if necessary, to ensure peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. In fact, however, I don't think the Chinese were all that intimidated by the deployment of the carriers. What they were is it strengthened their resolve to acquire capabilities so that they won't be intimidated in the future.
Since the 1996 confrontation between China and the United States around the Taiwan issue, I think China's military modernization speed up. And people saw some achievements, right? Now China owns J-10. That's the typical third generation fighter. And that made China is the third country that can independently produce the third generation firefighter. I think that's a strong signal to the US side, what achievement on military modernization on PLA side.
If China's own terminal objective is trying to so-called unify Taiwan by using force to take over, I think their military capability is good enough. But I don't see that, because they are increasing their military budget over the last decade, almost every year, 2 digits. And their budget is not transparent. Some observers calculated, they said, well, in fact, the real number could be triple or double the current budget that they made it public. So why they are doing it? They even, for instance now, they even try to show off they have the capability to destroy the satellite circling around in space. Why they did it? Because they want to show to the rest of the world that we are capable of one day becoming a superpower, maybe overtaking the United States.
Frankly speaking, the status quo balance of power is still strongly in favor of the United States. But the situation of balance of power is under change. And I think time is on China's side.
Since the 1996 crisis, the United States and China have often had occasion to test each other's resolve. Small conflicts, sometimes public, sometimes secret, that can be understood today as a pattern of confrontations between the two powers. On May 7th, 1999, in the midst of the Kosovo War, NATO bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. 3 Chinese people were killed. NATO claimed it was a military error. CIA had apparently furnished the wrong maps. In answer to this provocation, the Chinese organized mass demonstrations in front of American embassies. Less than 2 years later, China had its revenge. the 1st of April 2001, an EP-3 took off from its base in Japan. It's a spy plane that flies regular electronic surveillance missions along the Chinese coast. After 6 hours of flight, while still in international airspace, the American airplane was intercepted by 3 Chinese jets. This had been going on for some months. The Chinese planes came within a few meters of the American plane, a little game that the pilots were used to. One of the Chinese pilots was Wang Wei, and the crew of the EP-3 knew him well.
He had already shown through his past interceptions of U.S. aircraft that he was willing to take some very serious risks in coming very, very close to U.S. aircraft.
They knew him well. Smart Alec, hot dog we call him. He's in the thing and screw you, and Sam, he comes up like this. Well, he comes a little bit too close. And the Chinese, again, the propaganda apparatus turns on, and they say, our plane deliberately turned, hit his plane, and it crashed. Your fault. And we said to China, that defies the laws of physics.
The U.S. government had already expressed its concern over this to the Chinese government. I think in this instance, he miscalculated, and he allowed his aircraft to get too close, and it struck the U.S. aircraft, and it damaged his aircraft in a way that forced him to crash.
The Chinese jet plunged into the sea. Its pilot was declared missing. The EP-3 was seriously damaged. It was forced to make an emergency landing, but the closest airstrip was a Chinese military airbase. The airplane succeeded in landing there, but it was now in Hainan, and the crew was immediately taken prisoner.
Our air crew is immune to PRC jurisdiction.
For the next 10 days, China and the US would perform a diplomatic ballet, each accusing the other of responsibility for the accident. Beijing refused to liberate the crew. This bought time for their military experts to inspect and dismantle the American airplane, which was jam-packed with secret defense equipment.
Oh, they got the equipment from the plane, and they studied it and took all these things from it. Yeah, they got something. But I mean, it's no big deal.
Finally, 10 days later, a letter from the US ambassador apologized for the death of the Chinese pilot, and the crew was freed. What was left of the EP-3 was loaded onto a huge Antonov transport plane. Direction, the United States. The People's Liberation Army did the same thing after each small battle. They analyzed all American techniques and strategies. It was almost an obsession with Beijing. Chinese military development was entirely oriented towards a confrontation with the US. In 1996, China understood that aircraft carriers were the main threat, so they tried to develop arms to counter them.
There are several things that the Chinese have done over the last several years that play to this capability. One of them is they have developed a larger number of more sophisticated submarines, diesel submarines. And contrary to what a lot of people think, many diesel submarines are quieter than many nuclear submarines. They're very hard to detect. The Chinese have built a significant number of new types of diesel submarines. They've also developed a significant number of new varieties of surface warships. Both of these sets of capabilities have application to the Taiwan situation. And the Chinese have deployed the submarines in some instances to areas well beyond Taiwan. They've deployed them around Guam, which is now becoming an area of increased U.S. military presence in the Pacific. They've shown by doing this that they have the capability to deploy submarines into far deep water areas. And obviously, this becomes a potential concern to any carrier battle group commander who wants to bring a carrier up close to Taiwan.
We saw last October 26th, our carrier battle group, the Kitty Hawk, was in the waters in the vicinity of Okinawa. And all of a sudden, there emerged right in the middle of the carrier battle group, a very modern Chinese submarine that nobody had seen, nobody had heard. It came up within a few miles of the Kitty Hawk itself. And we know that this submarine is equipped with very advanced torpedoes, and that if it wanted to, it could have sunk our carrier.
The Chinese know we are dependent on two things militarily in Asia. Number one, satellites. Number two, aircraft carriers. They have demonstrated to us they can take out each one. Will they ever do that? I doubt it. This is what you might call psychological warfare.
Satellites are an American strong point. But if you look closely, they can also be a weak point. The U.S. relies on satellites to control their entire communications network, and that's a weakness. Today, and we were able to verify this during the last conflicts, the American military depends too much on its electronics and satellites. This dependence reminds me of the Greek legend. The powerful Achilles, who was invulnerable, except for his heel. And satellites are a little like the American Achilles heel.
The 11th of September 2006, the People's Liberation Army launched a missile that destroyed one of its own satellites. The explosion in space was obviously immediately detected by the Pentagon. There was consternation in Washington. Nobody had anticipated this Chinese initiative.
The Chinese have had an anti-satellite program for some time now, and it's designed primarily to, again, to deter the United States or to complicate U.S. decisions in the event of a crisis. So yes, I think the recent shot by the missile to fire against their own satellite and shoot down their own satellite was designed to convey a signal to the United States about the fact that the Chinese are not simply going to sit back, in their view, and allow the U.S. to have predominant influence. They are going to try to influence the situation, in this case, in sort of an asymmetrical way, by threatening what is regarded as one of the critical areas of U.S. surveillance.
The Chinese army has also developed another system to blind American satellites. These are giant lasers that don't destroy them, but blind them enough to make them useless. This isn't science fiction, but a technology that is already in use. And then there exists a still more terrible weapon, a weapon that the Americans and the French have already mastered. Its development was a priority for the Chinese army.
The Chinese have followed very closely the American dependence on the electromagnetic spectrum, the use of communications and networking among satellites and ships and command systems to fight a war. They saw what happened in the first Gulf War, they saw what happened in Kosovo, they watched Afghanistan, they watched the second Gulf War, and they realized that we are more and more dependent on the electromagnetic spectrum and moving communications back and forth. And an electromagnetic pulse, which is produced by detonating a nuclear weapon, usually fries transistors and stops that kind of communication.
An electromagnetic impulse weapon uses a nuclear explosion to generate an electromagnetic wave. When this wave hits boats or planes, it instantaneously destroys all electronic equipment. No one dies, provided they are far enough away from the nuclear explosion. But the American battleships, totally dependent on electronics, would immediately be disabled.
The Pentagon report described a nuclear detonated or nuclear generated EMP. I asked people in Pentagon, why don't you say they have conventionally generated EMP? They say, we don't want them to know whether we know them. The conventionally generated EMP is less problematic and it is more useful or more usable, because when you have this EMP,
there will be no nuclear fallouts. There will be less international protests. They already have it.
Yes, it is like shooting down the satellite, getting the submarine under the aircraft carrier, EP-3 Ensign-off Hainan. It is, look, we mean business. You pay attention to what we're doing. We're publishing the figures that our military budget is going up because we are creating a strong defense against you.
China's developing power isn't only military. The regime has understood that it has to make use of every citizen, every business, every organization in its confrontation with the United States. An arms race wouldn't make sense against Washington. It's a war to control energy, the media, culture, and raw materials. And facing an America that overconsumes, that is deeply in debt, an America weakened by its own excesses, China counters with its best weapon, its breathtaking economic growth.
The new threat isn't the classic military threat, direct confrontation between one country and another. Today it's no longer guns against guns, airplane against airplane, or tank against tank. Confrontation takes many forms, in many different areas. For example, in finance or the media, there can be attacks in all these areas. The object of these new kinds of conflicts is the same as in a conventional military confrontation, forcing the enemy to accept certain conditions. It's still war, but war today goes beyond this military domain. It's what we call an unrestricted war.
One has to learn to decode the battles in this new war. Sometimes they are small events that seem harmless at first. Thus, on February 27, 2007, the main American stock indexes plunged. Paris had just lost 3%. New York is in an uproar. The cause of this mini crash began with a tornado that originated on the other side of the world, in Shanghai. Suddenly, and with no apparent reason, the stock market there lost 9%, and it took the whole planet down with it. Nobody really understands what happened, but in New York, they pondered the lesson. China had just shown that it could use its new economic power to destabilize its adversaries, above all when they are weakened, like the United States, by the subprime crisis.
Beijing uses economy in several ways. First, by influence. Well, in Southeast Asia, worldwide. They invest money when the leaders visit that capital. Then they sign some agreements. The second is what you said. They would only hint at something they might do. For instance, the now $1.2 trillion foreign reserve of China as of the end of March 2007, 40% of them are deposited in United States Treasury bills. So if Beijing decides to transfer that to euros, it will be very painful to the United States. But Beijing doesn't need to say. It only hints here and there. And Washington feels a big headache.
Thus, China and America multiply their battlefields. There is the piracy of Hollywood DVDs, the recall of Chinese toys by American builders, the reception of the Dalai Lama in Washington, the buying up of oil companies by Beijing, hundreds of conflicts. China and America think that they have to dominate in order to survive.
The U.S. consumed over 35% of the whole, global consumption, right? 8 times as their population percentage. So they enjoy this position as the only superpower. Then they can get extra resources. So there is a bipartisan support stance for U.S. foreign policy. They will remain as the only world leader in the world. And then they will keep alert against any country, no matter the name of this country, China, French, Russian, Germany, India, Brazil, any country that can threaten the U.S. dominance, that will be a problem.
In Washington, China has become the major preoccupation of every administration. China is a competitor in the realms of economics, media and technology. World hegemony is no longer measured by the number of nuclear warheads. Congress has even created a permanent investigation commission, unique in its kind, whose mission is to study the economic and security challenges posed by China. Russia never got that kind of attention during the times of the Cold War.
There is a global plan from China. They have two. One was started in March 1986, called the 863 program, and one in March 1997 called the 973 program. The first, the 863 program, called the Torch Plan, was a global plan designed to gather and bring to China dual-use technologies that could be used to improve China's technological base and economy and industry while improving its military capacity. And it's an organized thing, you know. Each industry every year from the central government gets goals and targets and objectives and gets told to send people out and go do that. So it is organized, and it's not perfect, but it's organized. And the 973 plan is a parallel designed to improve their capacity in basic research and innovation.
People in the States pay too much attention to China. So there are some oversensitive on China. Then this oversensitive leads to a lot of, over-exaggerate conclusion. So that's no good to find the real fact. I think the real fact is that the economic power of China is still far ahead of, far lack of United States, not to mention military power.
If the French Foreign Intelligence Collection Service goes to a student and says, while you're at Tufts University, we want you to go over to some laboratory and gather this, the student can say, I'm busy. It's going to interfere with my dissertation. If the Chinese intelligence service goes to a student and says, we want you to, you want a visa? You want a passport? When you go to the United States or to France, you will write a dissertation on this, you will work on this project, and you will report back to us, or you'll never get a job in China, or your family will lose its house. Now, they have the capacity to do that. The United States cannot maintain itself as a superpower if we allow our industrial production to be offshored, to be outsourced. And that's what's happening now. We're finding very large amounts of our basic core industries. And I don't mean just like steel. Steel is one of them, copper, basic, resources. But things like semiconductors. And when we find that our semiconductor industry has gone from 12, state-of-the-art wafer fabs to 3, because more and more are being built in Taiwan and Japan and, well, not in Japan, in South Korea. And in China, if we're allowing our, state-of-the-art, cutting-edge electronic science and technology research and development move to China, we can't survive as a superpower.
This technological war culminates in cyberspace. China and the US have armies which are developing cyber soldiers who spy on or attack each other's computer networks. In March 2006, the US State Department decided to buy 16,000 computers from Lenovo, the Chinese company that had just bought out IBM. Some of these computers were meant for networks that circulate secret defense data. Larry Wurtzel and his commission intervened to stop the delivery.
Having been an intelligence officer for a lot of years, 25 years in military intelligence, and having also for a part of that time worked on counterintelligence and signals intelligence, communications intelligence, that I knew it was technically possible to alter or embed either software or even hardware into a computer that would allow someone access to a whole network. The entire Bureau of Export Controls of the Department of Commerce was attacked and shut down by, turns out, hackers from China. The State Department itself lost a bureau and all its computers by hackers from China. The National Defense University of the United States had its computer systems shut down, and the Naval War College had its computer system shut down. Other computer systems, government computer systems, have been attacked. And I think General Cartwright, the commander of the U.S. Strategic Command, has recently testified in front of Congress about this. So I knew these things were going on. There's more going on that we learn about on the Commission because we do have access to classified information. I can only say that in many cases, the United States knows these attacks are coming from China and knows that they're coming even from specific organizations in China. But I can't go into the details on who.
The war on the internet is as old as the internet itself. And one can't say that this was a Chinese invention. In America, the CIA and NASA employ 25,000 people to work on the internet. They have the largest internet surveillance and listening centers. So it's true, war exists on the internet. The war has begun without a single missile being fired, without the world noticing. The war has begun in all of these new technologies. Many civil technologies also have military applications. This is especially true of the entire electronics industry and the internet. They're new battlefields in an unrestricted war. The media, finance, business, all these are included. It's a war because there is real antagonism, and both parties try to take advantage of their adversary. It's a new form of war, the unrestricted war.
This unrestricted war has already begun. Almost everywhere in the world, there is a fight for oil, for water, for resources that are dwindling in the eyes of the West because of China's development. America uses its military might to assure its power and guarantee its vital supplies. China employs an asymmetrical strategy. It looks for its adversaries' weak points. Nevertheless, this war is apparent everywhere in the world. In North Korea, Myanmar, Iran, or Darfur, in all the hotspots, China and America are opposing each other in the wings. remember the words of Deng Xiaoping: there cannot be two tigers on the same hill.